Leaving the house behind, the Renodnal perform their morning ritual to shed themselves of social and familial responsibility. The evening movement ritual facilitates the neophytes' aggregation back into their social environment after a long, hard day at work. Alone, the Renodnal submits to the ritual. Together, the neophytes endure the challenges of the maze. The Renodnal enter the ritual space. They pass through special gates that separate the outside world from the sacred ceremonial ground. When walking through, the tribesmen are obliged to honor the gods with substantial monetary gifts. They believe that the gifts will protect them from inquisitive spirits. In single or double file, the tribesmen enter the underworld, a hot, humid, and highly polluted hell. Down here, the boundary between life and death is very thin. The underworld is made up of a network of tunnels that disorientate and confuse the Renodnal tribespeople. They follow signs and maps to navigate the maze. Religious icons decorate the walls. Authoritative godlike figures represent ideal forms of beauty, wealth, and power. Council elders observe from above the ritual activity to ensure good behavior and full ritual submission. The underworld's rhythmic stimulation facilitates a trance-like state. The constant roar of engines, swinging carriages and stamping feet guide the Renodnal into a dissociative state. Visual stimulation, geometric patterns, textured flooring, and mosaics help induce hypnotic trance. The hell-like maze creates an ever more disconcerting and challenging environment. The tribesmen experience an exhausting turnover of new people that enter and exit the ritual at varying stages. To help alleviate the stress of constant change, the Renodnal wear their own unique face masks to protect and disguise themselves. They hide their emotional states from others. They avoid eye contact out of fear that such intimacies will expose them to dangerous and evil spirits. Tribesmen carry an array of amulets and weapons to protect themselves from spirits and demonic interaction. Magical boxes held close to their hearts and genital areas connect them to the outside worlds. Amulets worn in and around their ears block out unwanted spirits. When the Renodnal tribesmen feel that they have completed their transitional journey, they may leave the ritual site at any chosen moment, ready to rejoin normal society.
So good morning and welcome to everyone. My name is Jen Sendel. I'm the co-curator of this event, and I and my partner, Alina Serler, would like to welcome you to FigureThis, and we'll be exploring contemporary figuration. Now, this event couldn't have taken place without the enormous energy and dedication of Alina, and it's been a great pleasure to work with her over several months it's taken to put this project together. And I must also thank Arts Council England for their generous support without which this would not have been possible. I was just going to say, actually, thinking about the film that we've just watched, how many of us here went through the ritual to get here today, either through the underground or through a slightly different ritual, I suppose, in cars. Did you come on the underground today, by show of hands, or trains, or what have you? And how about actual Rhynodnol tribes people? How many here are Rhynodnols? Yeah, we've got a few Rhynodnols, Londoners, and what have you. Okay. When I first watched this film, I was struck by the fact that we risk spending much more time than just the morning and evening ritual in a disassociated state, where we are not present, we are not mindful, and we're all disconnected and guarded. And both Alina and I wanted for a better conference than just having a few good speakers, a big audience, passively making notes, and that being the end of it. We stopped using the word debate because it suggested taking a position to be defended. Instead, we want to facilitate a truly collaborative, meaning-making experience for all attendees. We want to see if we can get some new insights and questions to emerge from our time here together. And we have plenty of opportunities for all attendees to be part of the conversation, and ask that we all listen for meaning, listen for understanding, and that we can benefit from seeing new perspectives in doing so. We have at the back there a pin board which has questions and insights, and we hope to harvest through the day, with your help, questions and insights we get whilst we're here. We also have some what we call popcorn sessions through the day, where I ask people to pop, which is basically you put your hand up and you, whatever is on your mind or whatever insight you have, you can share it.
So, yeah, I'm just going to firstly reiterate the thanks for everybody being here. I was actually really pleased that, although we have quite a few Rhynodnols, we also have people coming from quite far afield. So thank you for everybody who confronted the ritual to arrive here, however that took place. It's quite an exciting day today, I think, because I'm hoping, and Jen and I have been really hoping, this project is going to be kind of inflection in another inflection in the debate in figurative painting and drawing. And although exhibitions tend to be short-lived and conferences are short-lived, we've always hoped for this to have a longer footprint. So that's why we've got the catalogue, it's why we've got the filming of some of these sessions today, so that there are more people who can actually get involved, and it can actually go further than just the limitations of 2019 and London. I think painting and drawing are quite unique in their way of connecting the moment of making work and the moment of viewing work. It's different to most mechanically or technologically produced media because there is that immediate connection between the viewer and the maker. The untranslatable uniqueness of the visual language in its form through pigment is something that is really quite interesting, and it's why it's lovely to be actually within the exhibition, to actually look around the work, and hopefully when we have the breaks you can also take some time to look at the works. There's a materiality to the stuff of pigment that we don't necessarily see on our day-to-day experience of it. So we're bombarded with these images on our mobile phones, and when we look at paintings on mobile phones, the materiality is actually almost removed, and we're limited to the narrative or the content of the work. And yet, if it weren't for the stuff of pigment, people wouldn't really be painting and drawing. Human beings are hardwired to respond to other human beings. And there's an immediacy to figuration which allows the secrets to unfold to both the novice and to the specialist. Now, that unfolding can take place differently, but one of the exciting things about visual languages is that there's an ambiguity inherent to them that means that even with the same viewer, that unfolding will actually take place differently on a different day according to the context that you bring to the work. I think that figuration allows us to play with our ability to be transported by tales and moved by emotions and questioned by allegories and metaphor. And I really love to think about a lot of the paintings in here as being like the Albertian window onto their own world, each one. There's a wide range of different types of figurative work, and all of them are actually united by a quest for internal logic in the pictorial language. Just want to say quickly that if sometimes people make the mention of painting, that drawing is also there, very present. It's an exhibition of painting and drawing, and a lot of the problematics that take place with figuration in 2 dimensions are actually shared between painting and drawing. Now, I want to go back and thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank the artists who, if it weren't for them actually in the confines of their studio, working away every day, projects like this wouldn't ever happen. I want to thank Jen, who came on board right at the beginning of the project and has made it possible to actually take place, and we've been working closely together. I'd like to thank Charmaine, who's done a great job on the website. And I'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists, as well as everybody who's here today, for making the conversation actually come alive. And I really thank the Arts Council for deeming that a project entirely based on figuration was worthy of funding in 2019. So going back to everybody who's here today, I'd like us to take just a few minutes, and I'd like you to turn to the people who are directly next to you, and I'd like us just to spend a few minutes just introducing ourselves, to just answer 2 questions. Firstly, who you are, however you want to answer that, and secondly, what it is, if anything, you're hoping to get out of today. So I'm going to start, and then I'll let you carry on, but I'm Elena Serla, and I'm here today because I'm really excited about hearing what's going to come out of the conversation that we create together. Over to you. Do just take a bit of time. I just want to introduce our first speaker for the very first session that we have, which is called Visions of the Body. It's a great pleasure to have Corinna Wagner with us here today. She's Associate Professor at Exeter University, and she's here today as a specialist in the anatomical body and the waxing and waning of realism. I say here today about this because she has other specializations as well. She's the author of the eminent book, Transparent Bodies, about anatomy and art. And as you're just about to find out, an absolutely fascinating and engaging speaker. So, Corinna, it's wonderful to have you here. I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you.
I'm going to raise some, I think, quite large questions and some big, massive, perennial issues around ways of viewing the body and ways of representing the body. And I'm going to begin with that phrase, know thyself. So this motto is really a shared motto historically between artists and anatomists. You can find it in anatomical theaters all over Italy or the Netherlands. You can find it in frontispieces and title pages of books on anatomy for artists and anatomical treatises for surgeons and doctors. So know thyself became a really important motto historically around, around the Renaissance, just to give you a big general, around that time. And here's why. Here's the problem. Here's 3 comments that express this problem. One, this is a comment from a surgeon, as you can see, Richard Seltzer. And he writes this: even now, after so many voyages within, after so much exploration, I feel the same sense that one must not gaze into the body, the same irrational fear that it is an evil deed for which punishment awaits. Consider, the sight of our internal organs is denied us. To how many men and women, I add, is it given to look upon their own spleens, their hearts, and live? The hidden geography of the body is a Medusa's head, one glimpse of which would render blind the presumptuous eye. And I've put in red the sort of key terms there. This is about ways of looking and what one should and could and what one mustn't look into. And there's something really interesting about somebody whose life's work is to open the body, to dissect the body, to see inside the body, has this kind of mythos, really, refers to the Medusa's head, to think about all the issues that raises. Now here's a second quote. And I've only got three, and then we'll just look at images. And this is from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century. He says, "What do human beings really know about themselves? Are they even capable of perceiving themselves in their entirety just once, as if stretched out, as if in an illuminated glass case? Does nature not remain silent about almost everything, even about our own bodies, from the twists and turns of the bowels, the blood, the nervous system? Nature has thrown away the key. We can't actually get to know ourselves because we can't understand our own interior workings." And this is the third one. And I've just got a few, I know there's French speakers here, I've heard you, so I won't even attempt to pronounce these phrases properly. But the contemporary philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy makes this point about, you know what, after all this history, where artists have wanted to represent the body by knowing how it works, by taking it apart, by knowing it from the inside out. All this stuff about knowing thyself in that way. He says, no, I want to somehow draw a line under that and say, actually, the self and the way to represent the figure in art is all about surface. And so we should stop trying to penetrate deeply to understand how it works from the inside in order to represent it properly on canvas or in wax or in stone or whatever it might be. So he says the truth is there on the surface. And he refers to this Nan Goldin photograph and this painting to make the point that the bodies in both of these works of art are all the message, the meaning, the identity, the emotion is all on the surface. It's all on the skin. And it's got nothing to do with how that body operates underneath that surface. Okay. So I'm beginning with those three passages as a way to open up thinking about this relationship between the physical body and its interior and representation in art. So I'm going to take us back to this moment in time, 1545. So people say this is the moment when the modern body comes into being. This is when the modern body is born, and that is with the anatomical treatise by Vesalius, so often called just the Fabrica. So, oh, sorry, hang on, I'm gonna skip ahead. And so here is the frontispiece to Vesalius's Fabrica. Now, this is a moment where everything changes because Vesalius says, all through our history since the classical period, we have great sculptures, but they're all these sort of idealized forms. We have to know how the body really works, and the only way is to take it apart, is to look inside of it. And anatomists must have, with their hands in the flesh, in the bones, must have the dissecting knife in their hand in order to know how it functions. So too must artists go through that process. And this is a real shift in thinking, because before him we had, let me just go back. Does it go back? Yeah, just go back, if you could, just two. There. Because what had previously happened was, if you can see these two images, these are woodcut engravings. Now both these images are supposed to be anatomical images representing, obviously, the interior body, the female reproductive system. But what they are is they are woodcuts that previously appeared in a very sexed up book of biblical narratives. And so that's Bathsheba there with David spying on her as she takes her bath. So the engraver would just come along, and in this one you can see it a little bit better, would just cut a square and replace that all-important part, and then make this narrative then into an anatomical image. But that's the past, and this then becomes the future. This is the modern body. Now, what do you notice about this modern anatomical image? Anything strike you about these three images? These are from Vesalius's Fabrica. Yeah. So things change, but the idiom remains. The classical idiom, it's a language from the past. The form is from the past. That idealized form is still there. And it's a fragment, and it's an anatomical image. Yes. And this skeleton, do you think of that as an anatomical image? No? Because it's posed, yeah. And it has a landscape, yeah. So it's part of this whole organic system, often, yeah. So landscape stays, architecture stays, classical myth stays, and emotion stays. If you look at the skeleton's face, this is despair, right? This is agony, this is pain. But, so, as you can see from these are called anatomical fugitive sheets. Vesalius, though, sets in motion this whole process of thinking of penetrating and thinking about the layers beneath the surface, the skin surface. And so, for instance, in this image, this is Vesalius being dissected in this image, you lift the flaps to get to, the all-important center of the body. Okay, so as time progresses, though, artists and their anatomists, because they work collaboratively, and often anatomists are incredibly skilled artists, they attempt to represent the real in more and more graphic, objective, clear, decisive ways. And so I love this image because I think it just captures very clearly this enterprise, this aim of getting to the real. So this is a blown-up image of the abdomen, but as you can see, Bidlew, the anatomist, has decided to include the fly there so that the viewer gets a sense that this is a dissection that is happening, that you are there in the dissection room. You can smell, you can see what the anatomist smells and sees. And Bidlew sets out his aim here, and it tells you about this move towards realism very strongly. He says the goal is to pass on to our descendants something perfect without ornamental and misleading representations in the illustrations, because none of the anatomists, as far as I know, has ever drawn and published a representation after life. So taken from that moment, the moment of dissection, as the anatomist and the artist sees it, of all the parts of the human body. So he's setting himself up as this kind of new realist who is giving us this view. Him and his art and his artist are giving us this view of that moment that the body is being opened and fragmented. Okay. Now, again, for all that claim to be this is about objective imagery, the past remains, the art remains. So if you look at this image here of the hand, does that remind you what of any kind of art that you're used to seeing? And again, does it look like an anatomical image or does it look like an artwork?
It's fantastical.
Yeah, there's something fantastical about it. Kind of surrealist, yeah. It's what? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of like a still life, right? There's something still life about this. It's like a memento mori image with the book. And even this kind of image of the brain, which is supposed to be so very, very objective, here it is, there is no landscape, there is nothing else around it. Actually, there's something of the still life in that image. So if you look at the walnut or the crusty loaf of bread there, oh yeah, I won't go back. It looks something like that brain. And as we move forward in the Enlightenment world, end of the 18th century, William Hunter is often seen as the scientist who most decisively establishes the realist image, a dissective way of looking into the body. And here's an example of the pregnant uterus in his treatise of 1775. But even as he's trying to say, this is exactly what I see, by giving us, as you can see there, can you see that square? Yeah, the reflection of the window in the chorion, the membrane in the uterus. But that too, I mean, if you compare that with the kind of reflection in still life on glass, it is still part of an aesthetic image. You cannot take the art out of these kinds of images. But enough about what the anatomists are doing. There's also something about anatomy inflecting art. Yes?
Did Hunter do the drawings himself?
So Hunter did not, no. Many anatomists did. So, and some of them we don't know, because sometimes they had more than one artist. And often the artist would not sign it. And someone like Vesalius did a lot of his own images, although he also had an engraver. And Hunter did not do his own. And but he also had a very strong aesthetic sensibility, and in fact was the first professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy of Arts. Yes, and so in fact, so he was there's a lot of collaboration. I mean, that's one of the things that excite me, is the collaboration between scientists and artists, and Hunter is an example of that. So this sculpture, called Smugglerius because allegedly it was cast from the body of a criminal hung for smuggling. William Hunter saw him and said, he has the best muscles I've ever seen, I must have that body. And so they did, they got the body after this man was hung, and they stripped it, made it into an écorché, and he worked together with his artists to cast it. And do we recognize that pose? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So it's cast exactly in the pose of the dying gull. So even Hunter, and I mean, he goes on and on and on about, I will not even, if I see something obscure or anomalous in a body, I'm not going to smooth it out in the image. You have to include exactly what the eye sees. So even, he's creating this for art students and for medical students, and he is, yes, casting it in a recognizable aesthetic form. Now, so that's the end of the 18th century, but artists are turning to anatomy in order to paint, to sculpt, to draw, to engrave the human figure in more and more realistic ways. And I know some of you have heard this before, but this is a brilliant example of this at work, and it's this. So, has anybody seen this? It's in the Royal Academy still. Okay, so this is the anatomical crucifixion. It's an écorché made in 1801. And it was made because a group of Royal Academy artists got together and said, I'm going to get you to go back one image for me, and said, you know, if you look at the history of art, if you go to Italy and look at all those wonderful, beautiful paintings in all the cathedrals and churches of the crucifixion, it's one of the most important images in Western civilization, but it's always lacking in some way. And it's lacking because, and one of their examples is this, Rubens' Descent from the Cross there. They said, if you look at this painting, it fails in some way because that image of Christ being taken down or hung on the cross is never accurate anatomically. And people who view it can never get the real emotion of that moment. They can never get the real meaning. They can never get to the heart of what this represents. They can never feel the pain, understand the sacrifice. They can never feel the despair. They can never really have this kind of intense engagement with this image because it's not anatomically accurate enough. So they say, you know, Rubens, it's wonderful, but it fails in some way. So Causeway and Banks, they got together with an anatomist, Carpew, and they said, next time there's a criminal who's going to be put to death, let us know. We're going to come and we're going to take this body and we're going to take the skin and fat off of it and hang it so we can see the muscles, see how it really looks. And so this poor chap, a Chelsea pensioner, probably suffering from dementia, challenged his neighbor to a duel, and his neighbor said no and walked away, and he took out a gun and shot his neighbor. And so he was charged with murder and put to death. So the artists and the anatomist went to the site of death and hung the body, as you can see here, right away, still warm, to watch it cool and droop and hang, and then they cast it. And so there it is. So it's for the use of art students in the Royal Academy. They made two. One was destroyed in a bomb, but this one remains. So that gives you a sense of how strongly artists at a certain point, the 19th century, are turning towards realism. And then what happens after that is that we have at least, well, it's always sort of debatable, but we've got a big chunk of very influential time, a good century of realism. So artists striving more and more to represent the human body in that kind of anatomically accurate, sort of with forensic vision, as much as they could. But something happens in the mid-19th century, and it starts to gain momentum. And by the last decades of the 19th century, a lot of artists and philosophers, thinkers, aesthetic theorists are turning against this move towards realism, and in particular, anatomical realism around the body. And so, in particular, you get John Ruskin, the very influential artist, architect, and thinker. And John Ruskin says in his Oxford lectures and all of his books, he turns strongly against anatomy for artists and says, no, artists have got to stop. We've gone too far, and our art is becoming really tainted. And when I look back through history, I don't see what those three artists saw, which is Christ's figure should be more accurate. What I see is two strains. And from Michelangelo down, those artists who have had this anatomical training lose something. They lose a way of looking at the body. They lose a way of representing it. They lose this kind of intangible, emotional, sort of subjective quality to their art. And those that, all the way down from the classical period, who have avoided that kind of dissective vision, he calls it, produce art that has got this sort of indescribable something. Art which has emotion, which has meaning that somehow gets lost in the overly realistic image. And so he gives us examples, as Ruskin does in very strong language. He turns to this image dead Christ of Mantegna's image. Do people know this painting? Yeah. So, do we like it? Do you like it? You don't? You do? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah, okay. So I rather like it. I think it's really incredible. But, like Jen, Ruskin detests it. He absolutely detests it. And he goes on and on about how much and why he detests it. And he says, look at this. It is exactly characteristic of the madness that has polluted the work of Da Vinci and Michelangelo with that science of the sepulchre, with that science which is anatomy. It is revolting. And he goes on and says, women should not look at this because it will just completely degrade them. The painting is only an anatomical study. It is vulgar. It is ghastly. And he says, Mantegna thinks he's so clever by this amazing, well, I say amazing, sorry Ruskin, but this foreshortening of the body, this view that we have. And Ruskin hates it. He says, the discoloration and this foreshortened body is indicative of how science, anatomy, is degraded art. Yes. It's also what? Oh, yeah. So that is actually a really interesting point, because there's something really interesting historically about the fact that the turn towards anatomical realism happens at the same time that we get perspective and that we get new wood-cutting techniques and new techniques of representation, which allow artists also to represent things more accurately. But Ruskin loves that, weirdly. He says, this is the exact opposite. Now, would you see these as opposite? Okay, so he sees this as exactly opposite. He says Holbein is amazing, is a totally gifted artist. And he says the body of the dead Christ in the tomb is brilliant. And it shows us that Holbein refused anatomical study, wasn't interested in it. And says he's in the kind of tradition that those great classical sculptors were in that he looks at the face first. He looks at the face first. Now that seems weird to us because we might think we look at, David or those sculptures and we're like, that's all body. But for Ruskin, and this gets us back to those three passages at the beginning, Ruskin says, yeah, those bodies, though, are about surface. It's about looking at the nude, the naked body, and seeing how it moves and how it looks on the surface without thinking about the interior. And that also allows this greater attention to the face, which he says is absolutely important. And I won't go into that there. Oh, but just to ask you, at that painting, the Holbein, do we like that? Do we love it? This one. Just before this? Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. You love the Holbein, but yeah, okay. Yeah, you too. Okay. Oh, there it is. Yes, and the face. So Ruskin thinks that this is an amazing representation of a body that's dead, but the face is alive, he says. Okay. Now we might get upset here. So here's another contrast that Ruskin has. So he says, this image, he basically says Gainsborough's portraits in general, but in particular his portraits of cottage girls or peasant girls are wonderful. And he says, look at it. And also remember, what is happening in the 19th century is we have photography. And so photography is giving us, supposedly, a much more accurate view of the world. In fact, a view of things that our eye misses. It freezes, it captures, it holds, it provides an index to things all around us and to the body, and shows us the body in ways we miss, okay? So Ruskin says, forget it. No photography and no science, no anatomy, no industry will touch or reach for an instant the supernaturalness of Gainsborough's bodies and faces. And he refers to that painting, okay? Unlike, he says, in contrast, the Sistine Chapel, the bodies and faces, he says, on the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, no, they're awful, Ruskin says. He detests the Sistine Chapel because all Michelangelo cares about is showing off how much he knows about the body through dissection, being one of the first artists to dissect the body, to look at it from the inside, to get to grips with how it moves, to get to grips with its structures, to get to grips with its architecture. He says that from then on, Michelangelo, that's all he wants is to show off that knowledge. So the Sistine Chapel shows an affinity with mechanism. It's the body as machine rather than the body as this living, vital thing. No. But I gotta tell you, I love Ruskin. I mean, reading him is his enormous amount of writing is brilliant. But the thing, in fact, this goes with the theme of the day because he's never halfway about anything. He has the strongest opinions and he gives them to you and he tells you why he thinks the way he does and he changes his mind. He contradicts himself. He's fine with that because it's a big process of learning and changing and yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. Funny you should say that, I think. Hang on. Oh, there's a pointer. Hang on. There. Okay, so thinking about the crucifixion, and thinking about whether they're anatomical or not, and what that knowledge of the body gives to the painting, or the drawing, or whatever it is, or whether it takes away, what happens at the end of the 19th century and to the 20th century, and what happens when we get to figurative expressionism and all of that, and why that happens. And can I get you to go back one? And I won't say much about this because I know I want to push on time, but think about what happens. It's the camera, the photographic way of viewing. I mean, we all are photographic viewers. We see through photographic images, all of us, all the time. It's impossible not to. We've lived with those images for quite a while. So, in a way, the camera releases artists then. We could say release. This is an argument for us to have. Releases artists from this push for accuracy, for the real, for an objective eye, an anatomical eye. Some artists, like the American artist Akins, I love Akins, remains in that tradition, and so this painting is done from torturing a 16-year-old boy for a long time to get it. And he uses photography, and he uses dissection, and he goes to dissections to get to know the body. But then obviously we have this new crucifixion. Do we get emotion from both of them? Do we get the meaning? Does it stir us? Are we interested in the kinds of things Alina's talking about? The textures, yeah, it's the flat image here, but the textures, the techniques, all the stuff that artists look for. What's the difference for us? What was that, sorry? Yeah. More emotion, more tortured. Yeah. You said this is a Catholic believer, right? Yeah, that's right. And this, if we're just going to guess, yeah. No, that's right. That's exactly right. And in fact, one of his goals, as he said, was to take out the Christianity, really, but to have that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. This is, yeah, 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 yeah. No, that's absolutely, absolutely right. Yes, and I mean, this is one of the things about, I mean, this is another exciting thing about all this stuff is that, you know, nothing is anew. It is all this intertextual. It's engaging with, so all the goals, whatever they are, emotion, you know, identity, subjectivity, whatever it is, or accuracy, objectivity, it's all caught up with the models and the way of viewing that we have that is, you know, communal, historical, cultural, reaches back, way back. And then to this. I like this. You know what? This is the best part sometimes when you stand here and go, and then you faces go. You hate it, don't you? Okay. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Ah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a different interior. I mean, that's another thing about the physical interior and the interiority. Yeah. You're going to say something?
I've just never connected with this one.
Yeah.
For some reason, to me, it always looked like a form of chandelier, which is interesting that it's about light to me rather than the crucifix. So.
Mm. Interesting. Okay, so just by way of ending, thinking about where we are now, and you know, what are our new forms as I look around? You know, what are our new ways of representing the kinds of things that, you know, yeah, the kinds of interior psychological things that we are experiencing, and obviously individually, but you know, as a society, 2019. When we have artificial intelligence and machines, robotics, all this sort of stuff, all the stuff that we have, how does that affect the way we represent the body, the way our politics? So we have a kind of, you know, we've got the fragmented body, the connection between all of these figures. So in one way, there's a turn, some artists, there's a turn back to thinking about the body from the inside out, to put it that way. Jenny Savile's work is an example, and her training is part of this kind of training that happened historically. She attends surgeries, anatomy, thinks about dissection. She's interested in forensics and pathology, ways of looking, reading. The body is a kind of medical text. But it's also about classical forms, still has abstraction. And also, you know, it's a global world, and so also, you know, this is all very Western-centric that I've got it, but Eastern influence to go along with what is obviously a very anatomical, opened, dissected body in a lot of ways. And I love this quote from her: "Human perception of the body is so acute and knowledgeable that the smallest hint of a body can trigger recognition." And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons we're talking about the figure at the center of things. The body is a text, it speaks, it can be inscribed upon in artworks. And so, and there you all are. So I just included these. They're around us, but here they are. So yeah, I'd love to know what you think about the way you represent, the way you look at the body, and what we think it should do or look like, or want to see it look like in art. Thanks.
It's that seeking to be ideal rather than real. And It is. I've made it that way on purpose because it is a religion. The glamour industry is not about beauty. It's about glamour, and it's about reaching the unattainable. It's impossible. There is no fountain of youth. There, and the girls at the top, what they give up to be at the top, it's unbelievable, and the sacrifices that they make. So my work is about that sacrifice. And there's usually a yellow ring in the cult of beauty. It's a cult of beauty that I've set up. I have saints, I have martyrs, I have priestess, I have a god that's unquenchable. The circle actually comes from C.S. Lewis writings, and it's that standard of measurement he writes about in Weight of Glory. The standard of measurement where we view ourselves as accepted or rejected, how we view others, and what are we willing to sacrifice in order to get into the circle. And it's not just about beauty. Am I pretty enough, but am I smart enough? Am I fast enough? Am I rich enough? Am I what? Enough. We're never enough.
So it's a really interesting question, bringing in that idea of the idealization, the realism, the idealization and the realism, and also this idea of the ritual and the cult and things that are accepted and not accepted. I think that actually plays out in lots of different contexts, even the way that we work and the conventions that are embodied in the way that we work. And Marinella, I don't know, it's interesting that there are so many conventions that exist with the setup of life modeling and the way that you interact, looking at the body and being looked at. And because you're very interested in the idea of embodiment and the gaze, I was wondering if you could tell us more about being on the other side, the receptor, and if the gazes change, whether there's a lot of ritual involved in that, and whether some of the conventions are questionable, good, interesting.
I'm not sure I know what it's like to be on the other side, because I've only ever been on one side, at least in a conscious way. I am not a visual artist. Yes, I have done life drawing a few times, but only after I had started modeling for artists, and I often knew the models, or we had been chatting before they started modeling for the group that I was part of. So even when I have put myself intentionally on the other side, I have always seen it from their point of view much more than my own point of view at that moment. I do really love just looking at visual art, but when I look at figurative art, there's always a part of me thinking, oh, am I ever going to be asked to do that pose? Could I do that pose? Is that a realistic pose? Oh, that poor model. Or, oh, that's great. Or you can tell she loved him. I wouldn't pose with my legs up to here in water for anyone and any amount of money. So it's interesting how, because I've been doing this for so long, even the way I look at art and the way I look at other bodies is to a large extent still controlled by the fact that I am so used to being gazed at in that particular way, in that particular situation. And you're right, there is a huge amount of ritual, and I think for artists have their own rituals when they begin to work, and then there's a larger ritual in the life room in terms of setting up the space, setting up the pose. And I think part of that is to do with establishing boundaries. I personally quite like it because I I'm not a naturist. I don't even go to the beach in a bikini. So for me, it's people often say to me, and people have said to me this morning, oh, I could never do what you do. And I only do that very specific thing. And so I find the ritual really useful. And I think ritual, as we saw in the film first thing this morning, ritual is about making certain things possible that wouldn't otherwise be possible, just kind of adjusting to certain distortions that we have created, that have come about in order for us to live our lives the way we live our lives. It isn't natural for a load of clothed people to stare for minutes or hours on end at a naked living person in front of them, and we have some very specific associations to that, and when we're trying to move away from those associations, we create a whole ritual around it to make it okay, or to feel that it's okay, so we can get on with what we do. So yeah, it is a ritual space in that way. You're right, I had never thought of it before.
When you're posing, do you project, do you try and project a feeling, a mood, or do you get into the position and shut off and just try and be blank?
That very much depends on so many different factors. One of the reasons I love life modeling as a job is that it allows me headspace to think about other stuff if I'm writing or translating, which is mostly what I do at the moment. It allows me to think about that. It allows me to go over a bunch of things in my mind that I need to be thinking about. It allows me to think about my dinner. It allows me to space out for a bit. I am so often asked by people, oh, what do you think about? And I always think, oh, you really don't want to know. So that is interesting. That is not to say that I don't ever think about what I'm projecting, but sometimes I do. It depends on the work, it depends on the pose, it depends on the whole setup of a class and how performative it is. And if there's a theme to it, for example. So it does depend on many different factors. Sometimes I do. Life modeling is really not about projecting, it is about being projected on. So it's the opposite. And in a way, a lot of my concentration goes into allowing that to happen so that people get what they need and what they want, while still maintaining my own integrity as an individual. And yes, and there's a fine line between being projected on in a boundaried way and becoming a sitting duck for people's random projections that, that can really vary and become quite inappropriate in ways that, again, people don't necessarily expect. A lot of people ask me if I have problem with being sleazed by men in classes, and I'm like, that hardly ever happens, while very often I am irritated by women older than me who try to mother me and tell me what is good for me and whether I'm comfortable or not, or how could I possibly do that for 15 minutes when I know that I can do that for 15 minutes. So it's interesting that the things that I have to fend off are very different to the things people imagine I have to fend off. So again, it's that kind of enabling the projection that needs to take place in order for my body to be used in that way, in that space by those people, without that interfering with me as a person.
So I'm going to maybe raise some ideas of this idea of what are we allowed to look at, how do we look at it, and the permissivity of the gaze. And which is the usual gaze that actually takes place. And Jane, I know that you work a lot with this idea of female gaze, and also which gazes are the ones that we're usually confronted with. So we the naked female body is something that's very, very prevalent in a lot of art history and contemporary work. And I know that your work deals with those issues. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Just to go back onto the cult of beauty that we actually live under. I think perhaps if there was a stronger female gaze throughout history, we would not have this cult of beauty. And I think what's lacking is the nude male body intact in art. And, part of what I do and the reason I do it is because, first of all, I reject the fact that the male body is not aesthetic. I hear it millions of times. Oh my gosh, no, the female body is much more beautiful than the male body. And, it's just, women artists actually prefer often to draw other women. They turn away from the male body. So I think, or I believe, that the patriarchy have control of the gaze, and they have us looking away from the male body, simply because to unmask the penis is to diminish the power of the conceptual phallus, separate the two, and what you're actually left with is a very, very vulnerable piece of male anatomy. So take away the drama and the mystique of the phallus, and you're left with a very, very beautiful, very desirable piece of male anatomy. So, yes, it's about reintegrating the penis to the human body and rehumanizing the male body and bringing it actually to all of us to look at again, men included.
So the idea of beauty keeps coming up, and then going back to something that popped before, which was the idea of adjusting to distortions and being projected on. And we have this notion of being intact, being beautiful, and the whole, and the vulnerability or the strength of the body that's represented. Corinna, because you work a lot with both whole and distorted bodies or partial bodies, can you throw anything in there?
Where do I begin? I'm going to avoid answering that by referring to something that you just said. Do you remember the exhibition that was at the British Museum a few years ago about the classical, what was it called? It's called Beauty, right? It was just called Beauty. Yes. And so my expertise isn't in classical art, but when I was there, I was shocked by one fact that I will never forget. They were talking about, those really, really beautiful, idealized, gorgeous male, impossible male figures that had noticeably very tiny penises, I say quietly. Do you know why or what the theory is?
So in Greek and Hellenistic sculpture, the small penises represented the baser desires. It was, intellect and philosophy and that were much more valued than actually, having sexual desire.
So if you have a body like that, exactly that, this is a man who is, giving of himself to the Republic, is virtuous, is intellectual, yes, the philosophy, the whole thing. Yes, exactly that.
The patriarchy having veiled the penis with very tiny budgie smugglers even, in all kinds of art. I think perhaps the tiny, tiny penis was just another way of actually masking the phallus. Once you make that, the icon of the patriarchy visible, you diminish its power.
These are more powerful bodies because they are not, taken away from holding power, authority, and exercising it. They're not. Their attention isn't swayed by less important things.
Wasn't there there was a whole time period where they were painting scarves and things across the male phallus in the Sistine Chapel, wasn't it? And then they went back in and had to remove them. I wonder if it has anything to do with representing man as a spiritual man.
Here's my theory: is that God in the Abrahamic religions is actually masculine, and perhaps God should not be naked out there, perhaps, and it's part of that whole mystique.
So I was just saying that my recent experience for myself is going back to life drawing. I was confronted with a young female model, and for the first time a vaginal piercing. And when I'd been taught to look at the model before in the past, I'd always seen it almost as a still life, just try and represent exactly what's there. But for the first time I was confronted with something that made me appreciate the personality that was in front of me, and it changed the way I looked. And I can't say that I wasn't a little bit attracted by it. And I just wondered, are we allowed to actually be physically attracted by what we see before us, whether it's male or female?
Well, you'd be inhuman if you weren't. I mean, I have a studio full of lovely young men at times, and of course there's always going to be, how do you deny your humanity? We are, after all, sexual beings. It's what you do with that response. Generally keep it to yourself in the life room.
Yes, I would say that's the trick, and not just in the life room. It's I often find people attractive who I come across in my daily life, and I just don't insistently let them know. I let them get on with their lives, and they think the life room is exactly the same. It's a working environment. You're working, the other person is working. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to be attracted to the person. It's about how you treat that person, and you treat that person as more than the sum of your projections. That is still a person there, attracting your projections. Then what feeling attracted to your model does to your work, I don't know. But lots of masterpieces over the centuries have been made by people who were painting their lovers.
The power of society, the taboo of nudity, and biological mandates, things that mandate are the female and the male performance in society. One of the men said, the way that the women are talking today, if we talked about the women the way that women are talking about the men, that we would be condemned.
I stick by the statement that in today's society, if the language that was used by one of our group about men was used by men about women, there would be condemnation. And I think I hope that's a valid point. Yeah.
Was the language rude then?
No, but it could have been. No. But it could have been seen as salacious. It wasn't, but it could have been. This is where the point I'm getting at. That I mean, you said there's a lot of guys wanting to say things here over there, and I think we are now in a society which is not a happy one, where you are frightened to speak because of things like political correctness. And I think, I believe it has to stop. Full stop.
But perhaps it's just becoming more aware of everyone's views rather than just one side.
One thing that does come up quite often when we're talking about the difference of gaze, and when questions of the female and the male arise, is the idea of whether those distinctions are even helpful or valid. And that's come up in a few groups that I was hearing people discuss. And so I think it's very interesting, this idea of what we're projecting as well. What's already there as values, that are the societal values, our own personal values, and then what we're projecting on the model that we might be working with, the idea that we have, and our response to the body is so laden with many different embedded views.
As an artist, gay artist who does the male nude, I find that there's been a bit of a backpedal by gallerists, museums, and government bodies who fund art exhibitions, that we are supposed to be protected from the male nude or the penis. Because of safeguarding regulations, people need to be protected somehow. I don't know about you, but I think that's ridiculous. You know, as a taxpayer as well, I think that everyone should have the right to exhibit what they like, how they like. And so again and again, I get told that, no, we can't have that in because people might be offended by some sort of government or authoritarian perception and assumption that the penis is off limits and should be regulated to the back room or the dark room or some private drawer, or be veiled by a curtain saying, you have been warned, there is a penis here. And I think that's wrong. If I painted a female nude, there wouldn't be such an issue, would there? Because the female nude is beautiful and it's always been on display, tits, hips, everything. Because nobody seems to be offended by the female nude because of the patriarchal way that the art system, education, and the galleries and arts funding bodies who fund exhibitions happen and occur. How about that?
Okay, yeah, first of all, I think it's really, really regrettable that sort of battle lines have been drawn between female gazes, male gazes, etc., as you mentioned as well, or gay gaze or whatever. And there is, I mean, in the attempt to redress some imbalances, I think perhaps, things have got to the extent, not just in the male-female whatever thing, but in general, that people take offence so very, very quickly. And it does create a sort of a feeling, an atmosphere of uncertainty and not being able to trust that you can say what you want to other people, or that you can have a discourse without immediately being slammed by someone or the other who's taken offence over something or the other. So I think that is quite regrettable. But the other thing that interests me, again, is it's this constant contradiction that we have in society, where we're trying to put everything into a binary system of either it's good or it's bad. But I for instance, can't understand how do we define the gaze that we have for people on the island? What's it called? Love Island. And the way that the women kind of modify their bodies, and that they use their bodies, and yet they still expect, rightly, to retain a sense of being respected and being valued as individuals. I personally find it quite confusing as a woman, actually. I don't know what the men think of it. But I think the gaze there, the gaze in modern life is far more baffling outside of painting and drawing, but within photography, within film, within television, within modern media, within AI, within manga, within, there's so many diverse gazes at the moment that I think that's how does one respond?
I think that idea of going back to questioning our tendency to be binary is part of our neurological makeup, to want to categorize things and recognize things. And so we fall into the trap of sometimes saying it's good or bad, or it's male or female. And again, I think it's always this construction, a very complex construction of the values that we have, the social values that we bring to what we look at, and how we work with the body as artists. I'm always really interested, because I was really interested with this idea of the kind of the partial and the dissected body, and the body that's whole or not whole, and beauty. But the notion of gaze always captures everybody's attention and involvement, and it seems to be something that we really do have, that we're not quite sure about how to deal with. And so I'm glad that it has come up again, and it's always fascinating.
It's one of the themes that Alina and I have had throughout the project, really, and thinking about the gaze. And I don't think there is an answer. It's not right, wrong, good, bad. It's all about how we listen to each other and speak, show respect for the individual human being in front of you without categorizing them, and being able to have conversations too, where someone may say something that you may think is problematic, but just keep calm and talk it through. Let's see how people can come to better understandings about how they're viewed or how we view them. So it's about holding paradoxes, holding ways where we're not entirely sure. I might feel offended by certain things, but I'm just going to put that to one side so I can listen deeply and understand better how someone else may see something different from me.
I'm finding this really interesting, and I don't want to add much more, but I'd like to say that the way that we view expressive behavior as either offensive or politically correct and repressed is itself a binary. And I believe that there's a way of looking at the way we express ourselves through writing or art, like visual art or music or whatever, as not simply, oh, if I am free, then I need to be completely free, as in I don't need to think about anything and I can just do exactly what I like and what I feel like doing in the moment, or I am going to be prey to all the dictates of my time and not say or show anything I want to show. There's a way of taking responsibility for the message that we put out there for other people to see. And it kind of ties back to what I was saying before. Yeah, if you are attracted to the person that you're drawing, then you are. There's nothing you can do about it. You're still responsible for the way you relate to that person. You're probably responsible to your own self or your piece of art in terms of being aware of how that sexual attraction affects your piece of art and your artwork in general. And similarly, when we produce images or words, we are responsible for considering the impact that those images and words have on the world around us and the people around us, and the individuals around us who will see those things or who will interact with people who have seen or heard or read those things. So it's about thinking the way we depict the body, how is that going to affect the people who see it, and how will that affect society in general? But also, is the way we curate this exhibition going to replicate some stereotypes, as in the nude male body is dangerous, for example, or offensive? Are we, by kind of shutting away certain images, are we replicating stereotypes that we should really be debunking? So we need to be thinking about all those things. And that we are responsible. You know, we have huge, oversized brains. We are responsible for using them. And that doesn't mean that we are repressing ourselves and that we are obeying the dictates of some kind of society or whatever. It's about being responsible members of society, and we, you know, whether we are just walking around or whether we are making artwork, we are all responsible.
It is about constantly renegotiating our relationship with lots of problematics that we have to work with. And I think that idea of responsibility and being aware of that critical engagement is absolutely paramount.
Mirrors can be mazes. Labyrinths live in faces. Underlying influences often escape us. Subterranean forces that help or hinder remorse. How much of our behavior is free will or set course? Concealed core conditions, biological impositions, cognitive crutches and adopted superstitions, prenatal persuasions, cultural codes, subliminal priming, or if penance is owed. Self-confirmed biases masked as rational sense, or any number of other influential elements. Take oxytocin, that's been boasting about the brilliance of brethren while belittling and brandishing the other. as irrelevant. Add some insulin-induced intolerant disgust and amygdaloid paranoid fear to kill trust for a culture of conquest that exploits to exist and invalidates souls that dare to resist. See, about every genocide relied on pseudo-speciation, deep otherness mythologized, a dehumanization, a breakdown of bonds, a building of barriers, cancel community, assemble aircraft carriers. You know that. Can't feed the poor, but can fund a war. Priorities set to kicking down doors, kids under arrest for shot in a drawer, while legalized murder wins rounds of applause. But just as myths can draw out our worst, they have the potential to foster and birth new concepts of kinship that far override colonial tactics that conquer divides. Cooperative compounds, coexisting concepts, collaboration considering collective context. The realms of possibility ripple out from our position. Will the end of this way of life be our unmaking or our mission? Deliberate diverting to doing things differently, or drift into multiple global system failures and all ensuing unpleasantries. No one can do that alone, nor do we need to. Rehumanizing creates allies and more perspectives to see through. A system for the many can't be built by a few. It's from societies of seeds that the forests grew. We influence this world, and vice versa is true. So, let's organize one that helps our best shine through.
And I have the great pleasure of visiting our next speaker in Ireland earlier this year at his studio. And he is the most remarkable painter. And we would so have loved to have had one of his huge works in this show today, and unfortunately was not able to do that. They do have a material presence that is difficult to see online, so if you're ever in Ireland or you have the chance to see his work in person, I highly recommend it. And please welcome Conor Walton.
Thank you very much. Right. When I was invited to talk here, I thought I'd give a talk about what I do, but then I realized that I was leading the conversation, and I thought, no, I don't want to set myself up either as a model or as a target. So I thought I would try and propose some provocative thoughts, essentially, and try and set out some ideas and raise questions. Because I've got a lot to get through, some of them at this point will be rhetorical questions. So if you have questions, we may have to deal with it a bit later. But there are two concepts that I've been sort of mulling over and thinking about in my work. One is the concept of asymmetrical warfare and how it applies to the arts. and the other is Dancing Along Cultural Fault Lines. And I had a show recently in Ireland called Asymmetrical Warfare. This is the poster for it. I'll just giving my work a little bit plug. And this section is called A Painter of Our Time. Now, I've put a question mark there because I'm sort of wondering about that. Can I stand up here as a painter of our time? What does that mean? This is one of my pictures. As you can see, I'm a fairly traditional sort of oil painter. You might call a sort of an old masterish sort of traditional oil painter. And it isn't the most fashionable type of work, particularly in relation to what's seen as the contemporary art scene. But this picture, I hope you can see, there's a gorilla taking a photograph. It's sort of a self-portrait with myself in a sort of 17th century style, and I've put a gorilla painting, or a gorilla taking a photograph. The gorilla is Coco, a gorilla. Her picture was on the cover of the National Geographic back in the 1970s, and it always struck me as an interesting question for a painter, essentially. When a gorilla can take a photograph, when a monkey can take a photograph, why would we paint a picture using what is essentially much more primitive technology? And that's a question I think we all have to answer in some ways. A lot of what I think, I'm going to talk in sort of very macro terms here about, I think, some of the problems that we face in terms of locating our work in the modern world. And a lot of the issues were first brought up by Walter Benjamin in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And I think it's an issue, the issue of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction isn't something that a lot of artists have really still come to terms with. It's not something that I think has been really updated in terms of Benjamin's thinking. But I am going to basically make a few propositions about the way the world works today in relation to the arts. One is that, our notion of art, fine art, painting and sculpture, rests on a set of assumptions several centuries out of date. The fine arts as a group were put together in the late 17th, early 18th century and have not fully been updated. In that, if you go to an art college today, it's still, fine art still is what it was in the days of Beaux-Arts. And I don't think that's really legitimate at this point. Even when extended via avant-garde redefinitions to include fine art photography, conceptual installation art, performance art, this still covers a small fraction of cultural production, measured by numbers employed, market share, cultural influence, just generally what people are consuming. Painting and sculpture is a very small section of it. The most influential forms of visual art and figurative art in our time are movies and television. And that, our relationship to that huge industry is inevitably tangential and to some extent marginal. And the latest thing that we have to deal with, I think, is that Google and Facebook algorithms increasingly dictate what the public sees. If you want to look something up, you Google, what do you get? Google the most beautiful painting, and this is what comes up. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this. You could construct a conspiracy theory that, the painter of this person is, spending a fortune on advertising and pushing their work up the Google rankings. or someone else is doing it. But it is largely, I think, a product of the algorithm itself and of, you might say, the popular taste or the taste of people and the feedbacks between what people want to see or think they want to see and what they get to see. Google is blind. The bots are blind. They can't see or interpret images. They can only, if you Google in the most beautiful painting, if you type that in, it will only, Google will only show you things that have been tagged or described in those terms. So this is a problem for us just in getting through to the public. You could be producing the most amazing work, but if you're not in some way in control of the technology, you're submerged. So this, it's also, as an aside, the modern notion that there's no disputing about tastes, de gustibus non disputandum est. This is sort of the reductio ad absurdum, I think, of that argument. And maybe we do have to start disputing about tastes, and maybe we do need to exhume some older philosophical notions of beauty, which maybe this work doesn't entirely conform to. So, on the other side, in terms of we have the issues in terms of the problems the world faces us with, and then we have our response to it. And I think a big problem in the figurative art world, in the representational art world, is denial. Denial about what the problems are and the way the world works today. I've been to track, I haven't been to FACE, but I've heard about it. And what I've heard is that, both these, one might be forgiven for thinking that the moving image had never been invented. The painting and sculpture are treated as the representational arts rather than minor examples of the latter. Now, when I say minor, 500 years ago, painting was a big deal. It was the dominant art form. It's not the dominant art form anymore. It's really minor. It is of relatively small interest to a relatively niche audience, and that's what we see here. You might also think that the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened, and that our lives weren't dominated by the technology of cheap production and reproduction. And we're still making things, painters are making pictures by hand, using essentially Stone Age technology. It's, mixing dirt into a paste and sticking it onto a flat surface with, a stick with hairs on the end of it. It's very, very primitive technology. It's changed, it's advanced in small ways, but only in small ways. That the craft element of it, as time, still dominates. So figurative art occupies a tiny cultural niche. It's marginal, it's almost without impact or influence, and it's threatened with almost total irrelevance. When was the last time a work of art made the headlines for anything other than who bought it or how much it was sold for? For the vast majority of people out there, for the layman, they're only, the only thing that fascinates them about painting is how, a bit of fabric, stretched over a few pieces of wood could be so valuable. It doesn't connect with most people. I'm sure you've all had that taxi conversation, so why is the Mona Lisa so famous? Why is, a ruined Leonardo worth 450 million or whatever it is? But the outside world doesn't see what we're doing, essentially. And cleaving to a handicraft mentality, I think we are essentially fighting a war with bows and arrows, while the enemy is armed with the latest weapons. Now, when I say the enemy, I don't mean the avant-gardists or any sort of, ideological opponents. I'm just talking about the people that we're essentially competing with for the attention of the public. I think people in the representational art community can be too quick to believe that someone is stealing their fire, that if only we could get rid of the avant-gardists, and the abstract artists, we'd be in the top position, and it's bullshit. So this is my suggestion to you. This is us, okay? We are the little tribe of representational artists, figurative artists, and we're, dreaming of, beating the white man and taking back our land. It's not going to happen. Okay, we're on the reservation, and we have to, in some sense, I think, accommodate that reality and move on, and not imagine that we're ever going to go back to the 1500s when artists were superstars and were courted by, royalty and, because there was no competition back then. Now, we're not the only ones in denial, and this is something that we have to factor in about our whole civilization, essentially, our whole culture. Have any of you heard of the Limits of Growth? It was a book that was published in the early 1970s, and basically a bunch of social scientists and computer scientists got together with one of the first supercomputers, and they tried to build a model of our civilization, essentially. Model with very few inputs. Industrial production, resources, agricultural output, just essentially the contents of our planet as they were being processed through our civilization. And when they ran this model, it always crashed. Essentially, the civilization crashed early in the 21st century. And this is a version of it where you can see resources, births, deaths, food per capita, pollution. You can see this this is 2000, so somewhere around 2025, it's saying big problem. The whole thing turns to spaghetti. Now, the only way they were able to run the computer model and it not crash was back in the 70s, taking our whole economy over to a no growth model. That didn't happen. This was it was sort of, at the time it was roundly, it shocked a lot of people. It became one of the keys to the environmental movement, but it was also dismissed by the mainstream economists. Now, an updated version of that was recently produced by New Scientist magazine, and they tried to model, with real inputs of what's happened since the 1970s, to see how well the model was holding up. The computer model was holding up. And it's not perfect, but most of the tracks are online. The main divergences are births and deaths, where the number of births went down more than they expected, and the number of deaths went down as well. But more or less everything was still reasonably on track with the original supposition. And this is sort of an updated version of it, again running things through the computer model. And again, you can see, fairly early in the 21st century, you get a crisis. Now, this isn't a popular point of view, and of course it's just a model, okay? But it's interesting to think about how we locate ourselves in the world and how plausible this sort of crisis could be. Because if you want to think about it, you know, here is the First World War. Sorry, here's the First World War, here's the Second World War. As you can see, they make very little difference. You'd hardly see a dent in the population figures or anything like that for that period. And you're talking about a big crisis if this were to happen. Now, let me propose to you that the crisis in this is actually ongoing, and it will unfold over the next 100 years. Back in 2009, we had sort of a major heart attack in the financial system, and it nearly brought much of the economy to the edge of collapse. And what the authorities essentially did at that point was they took extreme action and essentially put the defibrillator on the patient and got the insulin injection out and, you know, gave a shock to the financial system, pumped in the medicine, and got the patient's heart going again. And the patient's heart is going, it's still beating, but one isn't necessarily clear whether the patient hasn't suffered irreparable brain damage. Okay? Now, I think if you were to look at current politics, you might conclude that maybe the patient has suffered irreparable brain damage. Trump, Brexit, the collapse of consensus politics, polarization that's going on is a sign of things going wrong in our whole political world, our whole philosophical world. And this is something that I think we have to think about. If this model is right, what we've experienced so far is only a taste of what's to come. Okay? So if you think Trump is an aberration, he may be just the hors d'oeuvre compared to what's coming down the line. And if that's the case, we have to think about how we locate ourselves in this environment, because it's not like maybe people might like to think of sort of a goodies and baddies where the enemy can be vanquished. The enemy may not be vanquished, and we may have to, at some level, accommodate the enemy. So this is something to think about, just in terms of what we're going into, if we're going into a long, extended crisis. Now, it's not like, I'm not a sort of a doomer and sort of the end of the world, it's going to happen, you know, tomorrow or next week or anything like that. But I would suggest that one serious possibility that you have to deal with over the next, over our lifetimes is that it will unfold as a series of crises and partial recoveries, but perhaps on a downward slope. So this is something that I think we need to maybe come to terms with and at least start thinking about. Now, in a society that is in some way in deep crisis or in secular decline, you might think to look to the arts for signs of decadence. Okay, and I don't mean decadence necessarily as a moral judgment. I mean it almost in a technical way, that a society that is struggling past its peak in intellectual decline and possibly in decline in other ways will manifest its illnesses and the distortions of its spirit in the arts. And I propose to you that, post the notion of, modernist progress, which has been the dominating narrative of art over the 20th century, that we might begin to look at that again and maybe see if there's a different story that could be told about the unfolding of art over the last 2 centuries. And to some extent, it is already there in the art history, because from the point of the French Revolution on, you get essentially the polarization of art into 2 camps, progressives and reactionaries or decadents, and a huge argument going on. David starts it off with the sort of, claiming the revolutionary mantle, but his students accused him of being Boucher, Rococo, Madame Pompadour. In other words, essentially a decadent. And the neoclassicists, while denouncing their opponents as, decadent, were also denounced as decadent. And you get this pattern, where the Romantics play with the notion of decadence, where the Impressionists are denounced as decadent, but also use the concept themselves. Pissarro accuses Gauguin of decadence, and Gauguin accuses Pissarro of decadence. And the same version of the conversation is going right up to Picasso, who called Bonnard not really a modern painter, a decadent, the end of an old idea. Now, I think the concept of decadence is really interesting. If you unearth any sort of notion of a philosophy of history, that history has a path and we're going along it, it has a meaning that I think we need to look at. And I think we need to look at whether what we do, not really modern, a decadent, the end of an old idea, whether that applies to what we're doing. Okay? Are we decadents in some sense? Do we manifest the spiritual malaise of our time in our work? Should we? Should we actually use this as a model to think about where we are in history? So, in terms of why cleave to an obsolete, what you might call, in terms of the modern suite of technological ways of producing work, why cleave to still mixing paint and putting it on a canvas is really labor-intensive way of working that really limits our audience. I think there are certain reasons why we can do that. I want to put the other side of the story, having been very negative. One is authenticity. Now, that's a big word and a lot of concepts lie behind it. I'm not going to get into those right now, but I want to put it out there that authenticity is a concept that is important to us and that we care about, okay? It's about doing something with conviction and doing something that in some way, that things that aren't easy, taking the difficult route has its rewards. The other is economic. In an era of cheap, abundant reproduction, the unique handmade original work of art has extraordinary value. Now, we may all complain about the value that we get, the price that we get for our work. But, broadly speaking, it's feasible today, even at the lower end of the market, to sell a painting for the price of a used car or for the price of, one of these things. And, it might take you a week's work, 2 weeks' work. Could you make one of these in a week? Anyone? Could you make a used car in a week? You're not exchanging like for like here. The machinery of our world makes most things really cheap, and really complicated things really cheap. And that allows value to migrate to other places, and particularly it migrates to the unique work of art. So we can sell things, even things that are sort of almost produced running entirely against the grain of modern technological society. You can sell things, you can make a living out of it. Some of us are living proof of the strangeness of that situation. The other is that the more the work is reproduced, the more valuable the original becomes. So I know a lot of people get worried about copyright and copyright infringement and whether their pictures are produced in China and all that sort of thing. I don't think that's a big issue for us. Generally speaking, the more copies we can get, the more we can put out there, the better we do. And the internet is a great way of essentially distributing images for free. And if we can make our work ubiquitous, it drives up the value of the original. So in that way, the original work of art becomes like a seed surrounded by a big sort of fruit of digital copies. The digital copies are what is easy for the mass audience to consume and digest. The seed is sort of contained within that. Now, whereas traditional art world is hierarchical and depends on sort of a ritualistic space like the gallery, the ritualistic, the priest, curator, the work of art as an icon or a relic that is almost treated with a reverence and a quasi-religious attitude of worshipfulness. The internet can allow us to some extent circumvent that very hierarchical system, very much based in physical spaces and museum spaces, and particularly a world like in the official art world. Let's say power resides in a relatively small number of hands. If you get a great critic to write you up, or a great gallerist to take you on, or a great museum to buy your work, you're made. Outside of that golden circle, it's hard. But the technology is now allowing the means for essentially spontaneous networks and to produce work that will reach a wide audience, totally bypassing the mainstream media and totally bypassing the curatoriate. And that's really useful. And that also reopens the door to cultural influence, because if we can get our work out there, if we can produce, memes, viral content, if we can use digital technology to promote our work, potentially the world's our oyster. Now, this opens the notion of asymmetrical warfare. This is a self-portrait. That's me up riding the dinosaur, and that to some extent is how I conceive of my art. It's a dinosaur, but it has teeth. And in imagination, in conception, you can ride it into battle. You can take on the forces against you. Now, asymmetrical warfare is defined as war between belligerents whose strength, strategy, and tactics differ significantly. It's like war between a professional army and insurgents. It has obvious relevance to a whole range of modern conflicts, like particularly Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I'm from Ireland. The Irish were essentially the first to take on the British Empire and win, and it was done with like a few thousand badly armed, not even soldiers. My grandparents were out fighting. My paternal grandfather was 16, and his parents tried to stop him going out by taking his trousers, but he kicked up such a hullabaloo that they gave them back. They gave him back his trousers, and he went out. But that sort of sense of what you can do, taking on a big adversary, I think should be inspiring. Now, lessons. I think we need to accept to some extent the marginality of our enterprise, and that what we are doing is countercultural. We can leverage aspects of painting which can form a critique of the dominant culture: authenticity versus simulation, truth versus power, tradition versus novelty, proximity to nature versus alienation. Don't be fooled into imagining that history's on our side. It's probably not, but we can have fun along the way, and maybe make a difference. But the notion of the avant-garde, I don't think is available to us anymore. The avant-garde was this forward force, and the idea was that the masses were going to come, the heavy artillery were going to come along behind. The heavy artillery may not come along behind to back us up, but we can still have fun. And I think if we think tactically, like someone engaged in guerrilla warfare or facing long odds, to think like a terrorist or subversive, we have ways of doing things. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to push you into actual terrorism or subversion. I'm not necessarily trying to push you into radical politics. If you want to, be my guest. But I think you have to recognize our marginality here. If we were into radical politics, say we were some little alt-right group here, we would probably be infiltrated by the intelligence services. Are the intelligence services here? Okay. Our phones would be bugged, our conversations recorded. Do you think the intelligence services are interested in what we're doing? They're not. They regard us as totally harmless and irrelevant. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that's an opportunity, because they're not looking at what we're doing. So, if you think like a subversive, you could get away maybe with a lot of stuff that a real subversive couldn't. So, just to give an example, Banksy, like this whole sort of Scarlet Pimpernel business with Banksy of who is he, and we seek him here, we seek him there, like what he is doing at the level of politics is not that radical, it's not that subversive, but then he can put a picture into auction and sells for 10 million, like devolved government. Is it a masterpiece? No. But he's walking all the way to the bank, and he has totally adopted the methods and the mentality and the image of the subversive. So I think our invisibility to the existing power structures means that potentially we can get away with stuff as long as we're prepared to accept and see that we are actually invisible, that you can produce a masterpiece, no one's going to beat your door down to come looking at it. You have to go out there. You have to do something with it. How's time? Have I gone? Okay. just a few big lessons, okay? Like what I take away from just in terms of the rousing motivational stuff at the end, what I think is really important beyond all the marketing of the work, we still need to have a core that justifies. I think we still need to embody excellence in what we do, the old-fashioned way. We need to embody wisdom, okay? And that's maybe a more difficult thing to do, especially when the world is going crazy around us. But I think, again, that needs to be, for me, it's a core, that there is some sort of wisdom, you know, and maybe it may be a strange sort of wisdom, you know. It's like when the kings are mad, fools need to be sane in some sense. And our position may be playing the fool to power in an almost Lear-like way. Address real issues, okay? Don't get stuck up in the ivory tower. Try to connect with an audience. Make your work a revelation. Try to reveal something important. That, you know, and I think the best way to think about this in my terms is, what do I really care about? And what really bothers me, you know? What are my problems? What am I divided about? And to try to plumb those dark areas. And there's a quote that I love by a French philosopher called Fontenelle. Madmen we are, but not quite on the pattern of those who are shut up in a madhouse. It does not concern any of them to discover what sort of madness afflicts his neighbor or the previous occupants of his cell. But it matters very much to us. The human mind is less prone to go astray when it gets to know to what extent and in how many directions it is itself liable to err. And we can never devote too much time to the study of our aberrations. Now, that to me is, you know, in a crazy world, that is the great argument for imaginative art. And that it unlocks what is inside our heads, essentially, and can bring into view what no camera can capture, because the camera only captures the external. That it can conjure up images from inside us and reveal something of what is going on in ourselves personally, but also within our collective psyche. So I think one of the great themes of art, and why studying art and paying attention to the art of the past is really important, is that it reveals to us a humanity that we wouldn't otherwise be able to access. So, dancing along cultural fault lines, my work, I'm dealing with cultural conflict, the crises of our times, political, ecological, financial, cultural, moral, the warped perspectives that ensue. I try to dance along the cultural fault line, which is essentially to sort of thread a path through a polarized world, a world of conflicting perspectives. Using fantasy, humor, playfulness, irony, the feigned craziness of the court jester, to articulate serious issues in a manner that is both challenging and mercurial, that allows and even facilitates multiple interpretations. And the multiple interpretation issue is very important to me, because I want to be able to find work that can engage with a whole variety of audiences in a whole variety of ways. And that, because our cultural world is fragmented, and our political world is fragmented. And to find a way to navigate that and span some of the barriers, I think that is potentially an important function for the imaginative arts today. My intention is to present to the intelligent viewer, aware of counter-interpretive possibilities, questions and dilemmas. What's going on here? Which interpretation to choose? Whose side is the artist on? Is he joking or serious? Is he crazy or sane? Is this satire or paranoid fantasy? My hope is that the intelligent viewer, aware that different interpretive possibilities cannot be removed, that the picture cannot thus be easily used as propaganda by either side or easily disarmed and rendered innocuous, is led towards a more complex and nuanced negotiation with the image. The viewer's own interpretive responsibilities must be acknowledged. The implicit threat to the viewer's interpretation and supporting worldview remains. In an age of crisis and revolutionary politics, the imaginative arts typically acquire renewed force and vigor and command our attention because they can reveal what is going on deep in our collective psyches and beneath the surface of our culture. Now, that, I think, is what we're actually seeing. You know, I think the imaginative arts are showing a rejuvenation, renewed force. But I would tie that directly to the decline of contemporary politics, that the two are actually connected, and that flowering in the imaginative arts is actually a correlative and, to some extent, a consequence of the decline of our politics, because it particularly happens when authority proves weak, fallible, and deluded. What we find in the depths can and perhaps should be shocking. And perhaps that is a context in which we need to look at the 20th century, the art of the 20th century, that to some extent we should not normalize the art of the last 100 years, that we should still be shocked or disturbed by what we see in that work. So I'm, to some extent, trying to exemplify the madness of my time in my work in a way that makes it easier for other people to understand. This is one example of my work. This is called Four Horsemen. It illustrates a few things that I suppose I'm dealing with here. One is its connection with popular culture. Okay, I'm going straight into popular culture and grabbing a well-known icon to create what is in some ways a meme, but putting it within a context of the apocalypse, so that it becomes to some extent like an allegory of current American politics. Sort of the slide into craziness that we see with the rise of Trump and other stuff. And it's a way of communicating, okay? Grabbing something that a wide audience, of the last 30 years who've grown up on Toy Story movies, can readily understand, identify with. There's the joy of recognition that gives an immediate satisfaction, and then what's going on here? And then the title, which puts it in a context of, doom, apocalypse, revelation. My painting of Donald Trump, which is called Novus Ordo Seclorum, this sort of got me into trouble, and I have to say I enjoyed it, but it was the starting point was a conversation I listened to on Facebook, watched on Facebook, which is who's going to paint President Trump's official portrait, and all the big portrait names in America seem to be saying, "Oh, not me! I'm not going to do it." You know, career suicide, wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. And I thought, well, you know, is there a way to do this where you could, you know, maybe satisfy the man's vanity, you know, please his supporters, and yet make a subversive comment? And I thought of Conan the Barbarian as a sort of a model that could be used, that would be very true to the sort of the pop culture or low culture base that supports Trump. You know, this macho world of you know, aggression and passive women that is sort of a really strong thread in American popular culture, and you see in the Hollywood movies and all the rest, and it was on all the fantasy art book covers and that. And I thought this is an interesting way of sort of locating Trump culturally and maybe making a statement. And I put this out on April 1st. It was in a show that opened on March 31st in Ventura as part of the track conference. And what I agreed with Michael Pierce, who ran it, was that we would tweet that the morning of April 1st. And I put out, you know, thrilled and honored to paint President Trump's official portrait, flying to Washington for the unveiling, and put it out. And it died on Twitter. It didn't go on Twitter, but it went kaboom on Facebook and Instagram. And again, this is sort of, you know, I got a huge range of responses to this painting. People on the left who loved it, who thought it was brilliant satire. People on the left who thought that I was glorifying Trump. People on the right who thought I was you know, being derogatory about the president, and people on the right who thought it was really funny. But it got that sort of, you know, people could take it in different ways. That is what I'm talking about a little bit, my idea of dancing along the cultural fault line, of producing work that is to some extent ideologically indestructible maybe, and that it can withstand view from alternative perspectives rather than be disposable as propaganda.
So thank you, Connor, for a fascinating talk, and that has raised so many different questions. I think I can't latch onto all of them, but this idea of the marginality of painting, drawing, sculpture, and the potential that opens up for subversion. I think also something you said, which was, should we manifest the spiritual malaise in our work? And finally, I'm really interested in this idea of the mercurial and multiple interpretations, which links to what we were talking about before, which is the need to renegotiate and adapt. So I'm going to start off by looking at this idea of manifesting the spiritual malaise in our work, or engaging with the social and political context of our work, and looking at the different ways in which that might take place. You've raised really interesting examples in your own work of how you're doing it at the moment. And at the moment, we're actually joined by Paul Branford, Charmaine Watkis, Wendy Aaliyah, who are three of the exhibiting artists here. So I'd like to open up the discussion to also how that's something that you negotiate in your own work. Wendy, I'm going to start off with you, if that's all right. In your work, you integrate lots of different references from art history, from the personal histories of your sitters, and lots of different symbolism. And I'm interested in how you weave all of those together, and how you choose the symbolism, and what symbolism becomes relevant to each work that you're putting together.
Right, okay, can you hear me? So my work is the one on the end there, which was, I suppose, a celebration of migration into this country and mixed race. All of those ladies are Londoners. This was painted about over 10 years ago now. So, and quite a few of them are relatives. So it was my attempt to celebrate what was around me. I was born and raised in London. I have lots of London friends, and we are very mixed race, class, and this is my life. I paint my friends and my family. But I wanted to somehow put in some political aspects, which is tricky, without being overt, without being preachy. So, as you were saying, using signifiers or symbols. So, for example, on the mantelpiece is a rubber bullet that was picked up from Ireland during the Troubles by a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And if you think of the history of the rubber bullet, it was actually invented in England and developed and has been sold, all over the world ever since as a means to control the crowds. And so, although this might seem like a happy scene of all of these young ladies that now, I hasten to have children of their own, quite a few of them, the power of the state has to be there, evident, in many of my paintings, and I use that little image of the rubber bullet canister with the rubber bullet. And above it is the Constable painting, so using art historical references, which we all know is this ideal of England on biscuit tins, etc. But it was actually a rage against the Industrial Revolution, because the scene that where he's looking from, behind it, was his father's mill as he painted it. So also, you'll notice through the windows there are security cameras, which are always looking at us, and did so 10 years ago. I think I first started using them in my work 20 years ago. This idea that as we watch, they watch us, and we watch each other to a certain extent. So it's a tricky business, isn't it? Because I think Connor does it really quite successfully in a way by reaching out using the kind of images that people would recognize, like Conan the Barbarian and things like that, to sort of make a statement about something. Whereas mine are much more hidden, I suppose, and they require some time, like a poem would require some time to read and digest, whereas I think yours are possibly more immediate.
So a lot of the work also is that navigation between the personal and the political, the way you maneuver that, the way you decide to maybe subvert the content, appropriate content, change it around, work with mass media, images, and I'm quite interested in the different movements that takes place in your own work. So I'm going to, both Paul and Charmaine, I think, and Wendy, I think it mixes a lot in the work that's in the show. There are elements of the personal, elements of the political, the more immediate, the more mass media. And Charmaine, you said recently that you actually work in a way which is from the inside out. And I'm really interested about that idea. So could you explain a little bit more about it?
For me, I think it's important to kind of see what's inside that wants to come out. I do a lot of research for my work, and I kind of get an idea of the kind of thing that I want to research, but after I've absorbed all of that information, I then kind of connect with what I really want to say inside. So I tend to want to evoke some kind of emotion through the work. I mean, the work that I've got in the show here, I didn't have to do any research for that because I made that work about my parents' generation who came to this country to help rebuild post-war Britain. And I made it a couple of years before the Windrush scandal, because at the time I thought that no one was saying anything about my parents' generation. And I was inspired to make that by, I found my mother's passport, and I opened up the passport, and it said, there's a line that says, to allow the bearer to move freely without hindrance or let, and to afford the bearer protection and as where necessary. And I felt that that wasn't the case with my parents' generation. And so it started with that idea of what could I say about my parents' generation, and I had to then go inside and really, it's almost like really relive those memories. But I also had to intersperse memories of my generation and my friends' generation who were born here. Because my work, even though it touches on the personal, I tend to open it out to talk about a collective experience. And if I tap into emotion deep within, then it will go beyond that. So it's not just about my parents' generation, it's about anybody else who has migrated here, anyone who can identify with being seen as other, as being seen as outcast. So all of those things are important. So for me, I try to get to the essence of that thing that I want to say, because in that essence that lives in a heart, if you speak from here, you'll touch other people's hearts as well. So that's the way I work. And I build in layers as well. So even though this piece kind of talks about history, it also talks about the cyclical nature of history. And so we're looking now, we're faced now with the same issues back then. You know, these issues about borders, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's British, are you really British, can you be British and black, can you be English and black, or, you know, can you be English and Italian, or, you know, all these things that are now being said yet again. And they need to be said, because if we don't keep saying them, people keep forgetting, and then we keep going around the same issue again. So, yes, so that for me is the importance of going within and bringing things out that need to be said. It's like an exorcism.
Thank you. And I think that also brings up the idea of how you then create the possibility of engaging with the viewer and it having a life outside the work. So the work exists and then you provoke a response. And something that came up in Connor's talk, and I think it's very much also, I think it's the case in Paul's work as well, is this idea that the viewer has an active kind of responsibility, an active engagement. And so sometimes you're not presenting an image that's clearly positioned or clearly too demarcated. It's not just about propaganda, it's also about negotiating understanding. And Paul, in your work, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the top bit, that's right. Is that working yet? Yeah. I suppose before you can start with maybe sort of different source material. Years ago, 20 years ago, I used to sort of quite avidly just cut out photos from newspapers, loads of them, boxes full of them, and that was a bit sort of like tapping into what was happening at that particular point, but also a bit like roulette. If you didn't get the paper, you would miss that image. But since sort of the internet's really taken off, you can practically, if you put the time in, you can see practically everything and collect anything. But the idea that sometimes people send stuff to me, sometimes I come across things. Obviously, the big political news, everybody's going to sort of have a look at that. Always, before making these big works, I kind of made that work for a sort of a bet, where a friend of mine insulted me in a pub, and that was, and that is a long story, but that came out of it. But before then, I was painting much smaller, sort of political portraits, if you like, and what I quite enjoyed doing was painting subjects that I didn't much like. So that almost allowed me to kind of play around, to twist their face in the image that I was making, sticking my fingers in it quite a lot, gouging stuff out with the other side of the paintbrush. I was experimenting on their faces. So there's a little bit of that, figures that you recognise, a little bit with sort of playing with the materials to create something out of their face rather than simply reproduce it. What I sort of think, and again, we know where we are. We're kind of politically pretty screwed at the moment, aren't we? We're sort of stuck in some mire. It's not necessarily going to get better quickly. So when things are bad, I mean, my answer is, oh, sod it, let's go to the pub. So another set of images that are in that painting are basically pub photos. Me and my friends quite often kind of go to the pub and photograph each other, then put that out with an insulting line on Twitter. You're next, Richard. So there's a lot of collections of things going on from pubs. And the third set of images are things stolen from social media. Some of the people that I've met, some of them I haven't met. Again, from various political points of view, if you like. So your political figures, your pub pictures, and your kind of internet schemers are all kind of like pulled together in a space that they never. I've done a few of these paintings now. The space never tells you anything precise about where the location is. It's almost like the people are staged. A lot of the photos I like are photos of people caught in mid-performance. You don't know what they're saying, you don't know what they're doing, and in a sense they can be quite contradictory. Somebody from the left is often balanced by somebody from the right. Oddly, in these quite like pairings of people. Somebody representing the left, somebody representing the right, somebody representing mainstream politics, somebody representing sort of the populism that we see now. Other elements of the painting are more chance. And again, when you put something open to the viewer, you have no control over what they're going to do with it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's absolutely fine. That thing was exhibited in Stockport about 18 months ago. And somebody looked at it and they thought, oh, God, he's very right. By the way, I don't consider myself hugely left-wing. I probably consider myself sort of leftish, which is fine. But somebody wrote in the comments book, oh, he's very right on, isn't he? Look at that there. Look at that. He's painting the demons of Brexit. They're not actually. What they are paintings of two cartoon characters, the Drunken Bakers, by a guy that I know, Barney Farmer, who's the tall, thin, purpley kind of guy on the side there. But what people make of it, again, you present, because with the internet, isn't it, how we live now, we're bombarded with a spectrum of conflicting information. Practically none of it we can take at face value. We can't believe anything. I think it's a Putin thing. If you don't believe in anything, you will believe anything. So we're bombarded with disinformation, lies, twisted, distorted facts from all sides, and we are left in this kind of confused state, aren't we, where we don't quite know what the hell is going on. And I sort of like try to recreate that state of affairs in paintings, if you like.
So it goes back to that idea of the multiple interpretations and the fact that actually there is always a visual ambiguity in visual languages. Is one of the exciting parts of visual languages is the fact that there is an ambiguity in the interpretation. And I think that what Connor was talking about raises this idea that things are going to be changing a hell of a lot, and things are going to be maybe in moments of crisis. They're already in moments of crisis, but it's just the beginning. And this idea of renegotiating new spaces, and the film that we saw at the beginning, is also about how we can actually confront those needing to renegotiate spaces and be adaptable, be open to ambiguity, be adaptable. And I think that the previous model has always been about trying to find answers and about certainties. And so if anybody came here to look for answers, I'm really sorry, because I think that what we're doing is actually trying to navigate renegotiating territories and ambiguities. And I think there might be a popping question up at the back there, so I might put it over there.
Okay, So the session title is Of Our Time. Sorry, where do you want me to go? Of Our Time. And our time, and you're talking about space and place, our time is the Anthropocene. Our time is really problematic. And we've talked about all kinds of bodies today, nude bodies, anatomical bodies, fragmented bodies, machine bodies. But we are biological bodies that are changing because of human exceptionalism, this idea that there's something particularly special about us in this huge ecological system as humans, and therefore we can take and do what we want, possess, have more, etc. And all the things we've then set in motion means our bodies are full of plastic and crap, and we've got asthma and all this stuff. So in Connor's image, there's Coco. There's Coco reminding us about the dangers of really foundational beliefs, like we were talking this morning about binaries. That includes human exceptionalism. And so we're talking about the human figure, but there's got to be some discussion about the human figure in our time as not being what it has been historically.
I think in our time, I don't know what you do at home, really, but I'm straight on the computer just to wind people up on the internet. So I think in this day and age, the internet is just as much a big space as whatever it is. But maybe you lot don't do that looking at me. But I think the internet is as much of our environment as the actual environment.
I just wanted to relate this back to history a bit, A Painter of Our Time, which of course was an essay by Baudelaire. And he was actually mentioning Delacroix, who wasn't truly a painter of his time, because Delacroix, although he used a kind of modern language, he was still painting classical subjects. He also used an artist who was an illustrator called Constantin Guise, the French G-U-Y-S, I don't know how you pronounce that, but who was an illustrator. And even though he was friends with Manet, who was truly a painter of his time, if you like, this idea of a painter of our time, and I think you're right, if it is truly an artist of our time, then we would be thinking Instagram, wouldn't we? And, film and telly, as you said. But if we're thinking of a painter of our time, does that mean it has to be using paint? Why are we still all using paint? I remember when I was at art school in the 80s, everyone saying painting's dead. This was, you lot are finished, was actually what was being said. And yet, I'm not going to say how many decades later, we're all still painting. So there must be something in it, and I think it's to do with our complete control over our medium. Which somehow you lose that, I think, with other media to a certain extent.
I think there's a need to touch things, though, isn't there, as human beings? That's why we do it, because, whenever there's a new technology that comes out, they always say, oh, well, the old technology is dead, and that's it, everyone's got to move over to this new media. And then, after all the fuss has died down, people say, well, actually, I quite like doing this, so that's why I'm doing it. And I think it's just as simple as that. It's just, that's all it is.
I'm an artist, so I'm struggling with some of the same things that you guys are struggling with. And I also am a gallerist, so I have to struggle with what audience want and what is popular. And I'm also a picture framer. And so I see someone like the beautiful painting, which was by Terza. He's very popular. We frame absolutely tons of his work, probably making a lot of money, probably not as much as the self-styled painter of light, Thomas Kincaid, who's very popular in America, has stores all over the world, and probably earns more money from painting than any of us. But we mustn't think that the audience has to be intelligent or judge what that intelligence is, because it comes down to what we like. And I actually think that although we may not have the influence that artists once had, that actually our audience is larger than it's ever been and is growing.
Yes, my question's to Wendy, and I'm fascinated by the bird on the left with its reflection. Maybe it's an ibis, and before I saw that painting, I saw a painting at City Lit by you as well, and I know about you. I spent a lot of time looking at that, and of course you've got an ibis and its reflection in that painting, which has only got two figures, a male and a female in it, so it's quite. So obviously, I'm curious. You may want to discuss the ibis, I hope.
Well, the ibis is a kind of symbolic bird, so when you look at it, if you don't know anything about symbolism, you see a bird that's chained to its plinth, so that in itself has some kind of signification, I guess. And a lot of my work is always stuck in interiors, and I often feel as a woman I've often been stuck in interiors because I've got 3 children, I've got 3 grandchildren as well, and so often the work is about people in a room. Also, I'm sure someone who knows Egyptian mythology, it's often found in a tomb. So it's a Victorian relic that my mother owned, that I have inherited, that just remains as a constant. There are a few items that remain as constants throughout the picture. As I get old, I should ask for it to be put in my willow coffin, I guess. But hopefully you get something from looking at that bird and thinking, why is that in the painting?
I was just wondering if in our time we really have any boundary between the private and the public. What do you think? Because there used to be indoors, in your house you were private, but that's really broken now, isn't it?
I suppose I find it interesting now, because obviously there's social media, and that sort of can invade all aspects of our lives. And I'm also conscious, I have young children, and I have taken a sort of a fairly straight view of shielding them, essentially, from as much as possible of not using them in my work. They appear as models, but I don't use them personally in my social media feed and that sort of thing. But there is an interesting issue. I do not do an awful lot. While I produce work, for example, that I think of as political in one sense, I try my best not to foreground my own political beliefs, because I don't want people to interpret my work through that prism. So I think there are still things that, that there are still barriers that one can keep, and to some extent one needs to keep, even if they're paper walls, to some extent. I think, what was I going to say? There are issues like in terms of the age that we live in now. I tend to treat the internet, everything I do online is visible. I'm in that public sphere as nothing is hidden. You can't hide anything anymore. But I still try to preserve certain areas for myself that are totally private, partly a responsibility to others, and partly an obligation to my work to leave certain aspects of the interpretation of my work open, so that while I'm a fairly opinionated person, they don't necessarily totally dominate the reception of the work.
Alina, in your foreword in the catalogue, you mentioned this theoretical death of painting. I'd be interested to know what people you think were associated with that death and whether it's still happening.
It's such a long and convoluted death that it's difficult to, and it happened in many different ways. I think there's a theoretical death of painting that actually needs to be contextualized, and it happened after the 2 World Wars, when people were actually starting to question the validity of lots of notions that were linked to painting, ways of working, ways of representing, conventions that were happening. And even the modernist movement, which can be seen to kind of engage painting in the beginning of its end, which is looking at finding the essence of painting and what painting can do. And then actually, it's definitely the death of figuration, if you want to look at it that way. Because the idea that the essence of painting is just the relationship between figure and ground, that means that all you're left with is a mark on a surface. So this is kind of going back to the theory of Greenberg in modernism. And I think that theoretical death was also one which was about how can we talk about the world that we've just created. And so it needs to be contextualized after the world wars. So I don't necessarily have any answers. I think that going back to what came up in the last panel was also that we also like playing in the mud. We like making handprints on walls, and we enjoy the stuff of pigment and color. And so at the same time, you can have a theoretical death whilst you're still reveling in the kind of viscerality of humanity. And for me, there's the theory and then the reality of how we negotiate those spaces. I'll throw it out because it's not really, again, an answer. It's more a questioning and a research process or a discovery.
I just wanted to thank you, Connor, for the cloak of invisibility. Just the idea that we can have that power of access. And I think that identifying that was important for me.
It's not just a material thing. It's actually what that energy, that mark, comes out to the onlooker, to the environment around you. So, I mean, it can be a material object, but it's, if someone dances in front of your painting, someone cries in front of your painting, you've done something, you know, and you don't own it. It comes straight through you. But it is to do with this energy and connection that comes through work and then goes out into the world. So whether painting is alive or dead or this or that.
Short question for Connor. That as an Irishman, do you see your position, where you positioned yourself with the craziness, close to the whole tradition of Mad Sweeney?
No, I didn't actually. It's an interesting thought. I suppose Ireland is on the edge of Europe and a small country, and there is sort of a provincial viewpoint. So I'm aware that to some extent I grew up in a cultural, as far as the visual arts are concerned, what might be considered a cultural backwater and developed. And I think that served my purposes to in some ways, because I think artists are slow to develop. I think that the visual artists, like I'm a slow learner, and I think a lot of visual artists often are relatively slow learners. And if you're in London and you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're under a different level of pressure. And I know gallerists have talked about, London sickness, which is essentially, a promising artist, maybe from the provinces, comes up, makes a big, splash in London, but then either can't maintain the production or can't maintain the prices or whatever else, and they go down the tubes. So I think there is an advantage sometimes to being a little bit out of the mainstream and being really sure of what you're doing before you bring it to market. But the other side is, you really do need to bring it to market and you need to get it out there.
I wasn't going to, but that links on with something that we were talking about in our group, which is public v private. And you're saying that privacy was important to your development as an artist and the way you approach your subjects. Because, so my question on the board was, is there a difference between public art and private art? And I don't know.
I think these days, the church and state are not commissioning public art in the sense that they did in the 19th century or the 18th or the 17th, which were big public statements which were intended to represent society and make a big statement about society. That tends not to be happening. So I think the responsibility for making grand statements has to some extent devolved upon the artist and maybe defines the artist's role today, where before you could someone else could tell you what to do, like the Pope or the King or whoever it was could tell you what to paint, and you just did what you were told. Artists weren't expected to have a moral viewpoint or to be responsible. They just took the money and did what they were told, and that's true of Rubens or occasionally you get an artist like Michelangelo who sort of comes up with his own program, but that was relatively rare. They did what they were told. That's not a model. I don't think that's a viable model for us now. So I think it's up to us as private individuals to some extent to make public art, to make art that makes the grand statement.
It was actually from that conversation, just something popped into my head. If we take Schrodinger's cat and imagine ourselves as the cat, and we lock ourselves in a box with all our paints and our easels and our knowledge of the world outside, but once we're in the box, we're never coming out again. Right? We're in there. Does that make us any less of an artist of our time?
So we're going to the very last. There are two speakers now. Alina will speak first. I will follow after her as a slightly shorter than other people's presentations. And then we're going to do what's called a goldfish bowl. And I shall explain that when we get to it. And I shall hand over to Alina now.
So I've been torn about going back to the basics or talking about lots of things that have come up. And I am actually going to take a step back and talk about something which is really important to my relationship with painting, and I think to every figurative artist's relationship with painting. I think that most, or all figuration, including the work that's here, lies on a spectrum which is from pure materiality to complex storytelling. And we've talked a little bit about this idea of how we relate to work and the materiality on mobile phones. And usually when we see images on mobiles, the materiality disappears, it's reduced to the subject matter. And yet this fascination for materials keeps coming up. Because this session is more about the materiality, our embodiment, and our relationship with why we choose that media to work in, both in painting and in drawing. I do want to go back to this kind of basic tension between the narrative and the materiality, which for me is at the crux of figuration. Now, true theory of painting in art theory has first off started with a very kind of art historical approach, very much looking at what had happened and looking at the hermeneutics, so the interpretation of works of art. And then theory of painting, as kind of pure theory of painting, has a long tradition with a relationship with mimesis, so this idea of copying the world. But I think that what really happens and becomes exciting is when we start talking about this materiality. So I've called it here story and texture. It can be story and texture. As I said before, it could be narrative and materiality. Sometimes it's been referred to as subject and surface. And in its more theoretical kind of words, it's just form and content and form. And there's a really useful philosophical model to actually approach this. And I want to use a quote from Maurice Denis, a painter, who says, "Remember that a picture, before being a battle horse, a female nude, or some sort of anecdote, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors, assembled in a certain order." Now, the theorist who is really helpful to this kind of crux of figuration for me is Richard Wollheim, who talked about twofoldness. Now, twofoldness is this idea that when we're looking at work, we have a dual response. It's the response to the mark making, the actual physicality of the work, a sort of abstract response, and then also the response to the subject matter. It's a really convincing and helpful thesis. And in his own words, he says, "I use twofoldness to pick out the distinctive experience that is required to fix the content of representational pictures. In consequence, this enables me to use twofoldness to explain what pictorial representation is." So it places twofoldness at the very heart of what pictorial representation is. It's not just another theory, it is the basis, the crux. And what's important in it is the idea that there's a simultaneous awareness. According to Danto, they are two aspects of a single experience. They are not two experiences. So it's maybe useful to kind of have a think about what happens at the two extremes of these distinctions. On the side of form, maybe you can see that we have kind of pure abstraction. And on the side of content, we just have the illustration of a subject matter. But what happens when there's a rupture between form and content is really quite exciting. Now, smooth paint and the handling of paint is actually a way of managing form and content. So it's not just, we're not talking about slapping on impasto and thick troweling on of paint. It's the relationship between how we choose to use the medium. But the duality does become more evident when form takes on extreme materiality. And I think the landmark in this, in art history, is really Titian, who starts to pull painting open and the mark making open. Vasari's famous description calls Titian's work pittura di macchia. So he's like painting in stains and splodges. Obviously at the time that wasn't necessarily a compliment to his work. But when the materiality becomes more prominent, that potential friction is opened up between form and content, the narrative and the materiality. And I think it's particularly relevant to what we're talking about here, which is figuration. Again, that's a word that's maybe up for discussion. But rather than seeing this painter's paradox as a problem, it can be understood as the very starting point from which all painters' decisions or draft people's decisions are made from. There's a really beautiful example, a visual example in the Prado, where you've got two Titians side by side. You've got Sisyphus on one side, where you can see that there's a really distinct treatment of the rendering of the form, which is more closed. And there's this beginning of the idea of the pittura di macchia, the more gestural and material treatment of the paint in the background. And the painting on the right, Titius, is painted 15 years later, when suddenly there's a breakdown and this treatment and the materiality of the surface kind of opens up. Now, this coexistence of form and content quite often happens quite organically. There are technical treatises and manuals about handling and rendering different subject matter. But I think it's really interesting to, at the very least, be aware of those decisions we're making when we're dealing with certain subject matter. And that would be maybe a weak hypothesis, just be aware of what's going on with form and content and how they work together. And a stronger hypothesis is to say that maybe we could be intentionally making them converge. Now I'm going to go back to the quote that was up at the very beginning, which is from Max Beckmann. It's not the subject which matters, but the translation of the subject into the abstraction of the surface by means of painting. Such a great quote. And I think the choices that represent form and content converging can actually be traced back to very simple things like the traditional nomenclature of things like landscape format and portrait format. So rather than talking about horizontal and vertical, we're already associating a subject matter with the way that we must actually deal with that subject matter. But any choice of format, of palette, of compositional device is actually a formal decision, and usually those formal decisions go hand in hand with what the painting is actually representing, the subject matter. There's a painter, Vincent Desiderio, who is a wonderful painter, but also a fascinating theorist. And he's put forward a theory, really, really interesting, which touches upon this idea of form and content converging. In his case, it's not necessarily the convergence of form and content, but how form can embody ideas. To quote him, he says, "From the start, I recognized that the real idea of the picture resides in the way materials are coaxed into meaning." And he makes a distinction between technical narrative, which is this coaxing into meaning through materials, and dramatic narrative, which is just the subject matter. He says the technical narrative should be the preeminent voice of the picture. Now, theory with visual languages always has its limits, and it's something we're going to talk about soon. Sorry? No, I thought that you couldn't hear me, that's fine. But I want to bring it down and actually make it concrete. I want to give a few examples. So, of this idea of convergence and form and content. Now, the first two are from art history, so it's always a perspective that maybe is interpretative. Maybe it's being thrown onto the work, but I'm going to look at some others in the words of the artists, contemporary artists, that kind of sidesteps that problematic. But first, let's look at Luis de Morales. He was called the Divine. And he wasn't just called divine because he just represented religious subject matter. It was also because he was thought to represent the most moving and subtle depictions of religious imagery. Now, if you actually look at, I know this goes back to the idea of can we actually see painting in reproduction, but there's a delicacy of kind of sfumato technique and this kind of layering that creates a more almost ethereal presence that augments the subject matter. Going back to Titian, Jodie Cranston has put forward this theory, which is that his paint becomes corporeal. So he's actually embodying the figures, not just representing them. And this goes back to the idea of convergence. And she says, the physicality of the medium also complicates the long-standing assumption in representational painting that the subject matter dictates and predominates over the means of representation. And here's the important bit. Rather than that, they affect and change one another. So jumping to the more contemporary landscape, we can look at Cecily Brown's work. And she actually cherishes that ambiguous moment which was linked to Wollheim's theory of twofoldness. She calls it the moment of breaking down, or the biomorphic moment. And like Titian, she talks about, and in her own words, the oil paint lends itself very well to describing flesh, or not describing so much as making an equivalent to flesh. Next example is Barbara Walker, and her work is very much about presence and absence and erasure. And she says that erasure is a metaphor and analogy for a number of things. I'm looking at how these individuals have been erased from history. Michael Armitage is a painter who's actually in a show coming up soon called Radical Figures at the Whitechapel Gallery, which shows that actually figuration is coming back in the focus and the spotlight. And I think his work is really very exciting. And he talks about the choice of the support that he works on. And he says, I think there's something of the character of the Lubago bark cloth and its resistance to being painted on that parallels the frictions in cultural changes within Kenya and of Kenyan culture within a global community. Now, this is just a quick talk, so I just want to go back to this idea that these discussions don't necessarily need to be overtly theoretical and deconstructive. Sometimes the convergence occurs quite organically after years of engagement and decision-making and thinking through the paint, which is something that comes up a lot. Desiderio again says, the terse relationship between thought and action and the making of things is at its best when it's not self-conscious. It goes back to that idea of fast thinking, slow thinking, what happens when we're aware of things or not. And people like Titian and Rembrandt and Goya, going back, are actually an example of what happens in the late years through a life's worth of making choices through paint. And just to conclude, the idea of form and content converging, there's this beautiful quote which I've used a lot in the relationship to a lot of the paintings that we're actually sitting amongst. This idea of how paint can come to embody an idea. Now that idea could be narrative, it could be more evocative. And there's a beautiful quote by Daniel Maidman, who was interviewing Vincent Desiderio, and he says, one senses the presence of ideas in them, in the work, as one senses an enormous animal moving in a dense forest. It appears only in glimpses, but its passage disturbs trees and air. And I just want to throw out that idea that form and content, the materiality of the work, and how we're actually deciding to paint and use this stuff of mud, like you were making reference to, Connor, going back to this very visceral materiality is actually at the heart of the decision to choose to paint. And just throw out that awareness of the balance between the storytelling and the materiality. And I think that's all.
I'm going to be speaking about embodiment, and in a way it's similar to what Alina's been talking about. She's talking about the materiality of the paint. I'm going to be talking about the materiality of our own corporal bodies, our bodies and our experience in our bodies. And what this might mean for a figurative artist, but it could apply to different cultural activities. We're told we are in a new age, and we thought we were heading to the age of Aquarius, but we find ourselves in the Anthropocene, and our kind might be referred to as Homo plasticus. And there is a new art form I've been reading about, it's vogue, called rather disturbingly O, or object-oriented ontology. And it's artworks where the human being is not present at all. It might be some ants in a glass case that continues on when the gallery is closed. And we might prefer to wipe out man because we're a little concerned about our impact on our beautiful planet. But in reality, we somehow have to find a way of integrating ourselves with the natural world of our planet. Disassociated man, the tribe who travel with their special screens on the underground, disassociated is not only disassociated from himself or herself, is disassociated from the planet and all life on the planet. So I think perhaps the school of OOO, of object-orientated ontology, perhaps isn't such a great art school or theory I think we have to face that we are here, we are real, we're embodied, and we have a massive impact on our Earth. Perhaps we could look at what it is to be not embodied. Some people call it being in your head, disconnected from the here and the now. From a state of being. It's the condition where perhaps we're ruminating and agonizing over the past, or we're worrying and obsessing about the future. It prevents us from being present. I remember being part of, there was a very formal sight-size drawing class I went to. And those of you that know sight size might not will know, but you measure very carefully and you pace backwards and forwards, constantly measuring. And the whole class was doing this. We were very, very, very carefully looking for excellence and accuracy and using our visual abilities to draw. And there was actually we entered into a deep state of group observation as a group. And there was almost a pulse and a rhythm as we quietly paced backwards and forwards, deeply observing the model who was sitting very quietly and patiently and bravely in some places. And at the end, we had a multi-perspectival group of drawings. Each human being had gazed deeply, desperately trying to observe as best they can and observe the light and observe the forms. Almost as a group, we formed in all our artworks a special group artwork, although it wasn't collaborative in any way or intended to be. However, it was collaborative. And with the same group, we had some portrait work we were doing in the afternoon. And we had a model come in who was putting earphones in. And, excuse me, and as she sat and the earphones went in, she sort of slumped, and a dead look came over her. She disassociated from the experience of being in the room. And in the end, we had to ask her to please not put the earphones in, because the magic was lost, because she was disassociating. It was quite interesting with the things Marinella was saying earlier about being a model and how present or not present. But certainly this experience of having these earphones was just taking her out of that state. And we had another time, actually, my daughter Jessica over there was modelling, and the tutor put her in a quite difficult pose. It was just a portrait pose, but she was really twisted, and she was starting to suffer from the pose. She was suffering physically. And the tutor, who's a very good artist, was tearing his hair out because he couldn't get her right. And I thought, you can't get her right because she is in pain. And you're not able to pick out what is core to Jessica because you've actually got somebody in pain in front of you, which he was not. He really was looking just at her surface and her as he wasn't engaging with the fullness of her being and her discomfort. So in this room, everyone here we all come with a container of our own beliefs and perspective and experience. When we're present, we're engaged in our body, and we're not thinking about the past and worrying about the future, we can become aware of what our fellow beings have in their containers. We can listen, we can share, and we might even find something new which neither of us have come with. But in our interaction, the space between us, we discover collaborative meaning making. And I definitely, that's not a very good term, is it? I've seen it happening here today where new stuff is coming up that perhaps we hadn't thought out. We've either got it from someone else or we've created some new kind of thinking. And there's good reason I'm showing those slides, not to diss anyone who's not shown slides, but I started to think when I spoke, I wanted to be engaged with you rather than looking at pictures that are not here in the room. Because we're here in the room with these pictures. And our discussions, the artists in the room, the thinkers in the room, the pictures in the room are all creating a sort of perfect storm, to use perhaps not the best phrase, of an aesthetic experience here, now, that will never be repeated again. We're all here, we're interacting with each other and these works and everything that's come together to this special experience together. We're co-creating something. I've heard a lot about the death of the author, and it's interesting that the death of the author came at the time when women and people of colour were just coming into their own. And the critic reappropriated the power at that point. And I don't think we can say that other people don't have a right to have some authorship when they look at a work. So I try to think of, there's not the death of the author or the death of the artist, but we're having an embodied shared experience when we look at a work of art. You look at the work, everything the artist has brought to you and all their experiences speaks for them, and they're able to speak as well. And then we also bring everything that we have, and we collaborate with an artist, with their piece of work. And the works even start to collaborate with each other and create new meanings and things we can start to... When we hung the show, we were looking at works, we agonized over it, but in the end, we felt every work was exactly where it needed to be and had a relationship with the other pieces. So this is a completely unique experience. It will never happen again like this again. I had a friend of mine, a New York artist, and we were on a residency. He said, he hadn't managed to produce much work. And he said, maybe, he said, I don't need to make art. Maybe I could just act like an artist. And I laughed at him. I said, no, you dummy. You have to make art. But it did get me thinking, how does an artist act? Artists act by making art. It's strange that we talk about conceptual artists as if it was some new idea. All art is conceptual. But after the concept comes the making, which Alina was talking about. And the making can't be comprehended by those who do not make. The embodied present experience of making a piece of art is something can only be experienced. We could talk about it till the cows come home, but there's something about being in front of a piece of work and there's a relationship with reality and your materials and your body and your eyes and the world around you. So I just want to be a bit more embodied. So I'm here in this room with you. I'm not showing you any slides. We're here with the works. And I want to try and just have a response that's right now. And I was thinking about Jane, actually, and Jane's work. And when we first met, and we were on the Norfolk coast, I'd never met her before. And there was this woman, her hair was everywhere, the wind was blowing, it was chilly. And she was painting this amazing painting of these fishermen who were on the boats, but they just brought the catch in. And she was painting them. Knowing what I know about painting out of doors, and I knew the experience she was having. And it's the totality of being planted in place, your feet are on the earth, the air is blowing through your hair, it's cold, you're struggling with your materials, but you've got this vision. And she has an amazing relationship with the ordinary men that work the land and work on the sea on the Norfolk coast. So Jane has an amazing embodied practice in her artwork. And I'm looking at Alina here because I'm going to say something I'm ashamed of. Because Alina and I, we've worked together, we talk about theory so much, so many times we think the same thing, yet I have not engaged with Alina's piece of work and talked to her about her process and her work. So here I am embodied, realizing I've missed something terrible. Sorry. Paul, I went to his studio, and he has amazing drawings. I wanted to have them here as well, but we couldn't fit everything in. We had the painting. But it was great talking to him, and just being in his studio and having a cup of tea together and having his wife there with her drawings here too, just engaging at that moment in the studio. The same when I went to see Connor, he told me about using Spinel black. And here we are at his palette, and he's like, look at this Spinel black, and it does this differently. And okay, oh my God, yes, Spinel black. I'm not thinking about theory or anything, I'm just like, wow, I just want some Spinel black to try at home. It's about being embodied. We're there, the material's there, we're together, we're in the now. So I'm going to explain how a goldfish bowl works. The idea is that we create, I think my brother laughed at me, King Arthur's Round Table, we create a round movement of people. So we're concentric circles all around a central 5 chairs. We'll put 5 chairs in the center, and if we can move everyone that goes all around the goldfish bowl, and we're going to have a communal discussion. We'll start off with Alina and myself, and oh gosh, I'm running out of names. We've got Emma Brassington's going to join us because we had someone fall out. Thank you, Emma, for stepping in there, and John Devane.
But I think this last session came out of the idea of the interest with the materiality, the mark making and the painting, and also the idea of the embodiment and the ritualization that can take place when you make work, and also that you can represent within work. So I think lots of different things are going to come out of this session, because maybe there are lots of different directions it can take. I know that John, you've talked a lot and work a lot with the idea of kind of materiality and the mark making. I was wondering if you could throw in any thoughts there.
Sure, yeah, I think one of the, I'm probably going to lower the bar a bit now, but I mean, for me, one of the key aspects to any artist's armory, I think now, is the use of chance, serendipitous sort of connections. So that I'm very interested in the idea of how paint is used to make an image in much the way that Alina was talking. But I think that one of the things that's happened for me in making art over the years is that sometimes those chance elements that might occur, for instance, David Sylvester's interviews with Francis Bacon for me is still an amazing text about painting, because it talks about this sense of chance, this sense of the unexpected. And I think, I mean, what I do paintings of figures and figurative structures, if you like, but they're often born out of a degree of chance elements. They're not literally collages, but they might be just things chanced upon. I mean, I know other artists have said similar things. So to me, it's a physical thing about breaking the logic and breaking the predictability of what might otherwise be a more straightforward sort of figurative situation. But it also is an empowering thing, I think. So that's what I'd like to put in at this moment in time. But it's connected to the materiality, the physical making of images, I think.
I think that connects to that idea that some of the thought process, it's not about theory all the time. We're not talking about, when I'm standing in front of making work or even making films, that I'm going through all the theory in my mind. The theory might be there as an underpinning, but then everything happens quite spontaneously, and I think it's Albach who talks about kind of even accidents, the choice to keep an accident or not is a form of decision-making. And I really like this idea of decision-making, constant decision-making.
I was just thinking, yes, about this decision-making, and it is an interesting thing, the art of the accident, because I don't like art I don't like too much accident. There's this sort of difficult path to take between having a concept at the beginning of a piece of work and certain ideas, and then as you travel the journey of facing the reality of your work as opposed to what you thought it was going to be in the beginning, that can actually be quite a difficult journey. And whether I actually try and fight it in and leave that behind. But I have to exit my seat in just a moment. But just before I go and say to Emma, perhaps she could talk about the accident of filmmaking. I don't know or did you really control it?
So, talking about embodiment in work and with painting, I guess the embodiment is, and choice and decision making is control. And when you're embodied, often people think, oh, therefore you're in control, but it's actually like being able to take things come as they go and then bringing in the accident or not. And then related to the filmmaking, I guess it was quite an embodied thing for me because I was outside of my comfort zone, so the real physical effects that having a camera in my hand was having on me, it changed the way I was interacting with people. I was slightly nervous, I was probably like shying away at points. So as an embodied artist at that moment, I was very aware of my physical state. And then, I wasn't controlling what was being visible. I could decide shots, or I had help setting up some of the shots, but a lot of it was definitely by chance, and then being able to observe other people as they were moving around in the space. And when I was doing some of the research that goes into that, it all came out of masks. Like I make a lot of masks, and I'm really interested in the embodiment of when you wear a physical thing on your face, how it changes your body on a very physical level. And I was doing some research into wearing a mask of the everyday, and I was looking at research of poker players and how they subdue their emotions. But you have micro expressions that are constantly informing people around you on how you're feeling, a bit like what you were saying earlier about, if a model's in the space, if you're embodied, you can feel that model's presence. So it's interesting on the tube as well, as when we're constantly subduing our micro expressions, and it actually has like negative psychological effects which increase isolation, and there's a lot of correlation between different working professions where you have to hold a certain face and how that affects you. And I think it's quite interesting and important to raise awareness of that.
Hi. Many years ago, I used to visit Dungeness, and at the time, a certain filmmaker called Eric Jarman was setting up the scene for his film The Garden. And I was down there drawing in the landscape and the flatness. And I met him in a pub called the Britannia. And he says, "You're an artist?" I said, "Yeah. I'm working on a film. Can you work a camera? A Bolex camera?" I said, "No, I have no idea." "Well, I've got a spare one. Use it, see what happens." And that was a pure chance, and I was terrified. Very charming. And I just had to go, and it was pure chance that I got the exposure right and the timing right, and I was just filming on an ad hoc basis. No script, no direction, and I was just observing what was happening, including a plastic bag which was blowing in the wind, which he really liked, but it was edited out of the film. And it was those little subtle bits and pieces that made me think about really looking and playing with chance. And recently I was painting a picture, quite a big one, of a figure in front of a sunflower. And I was having terrible trouble trying to get all the seeds right, all those concentric mathematical patterns. And in the end, I thought I've got to black it all out because it's doing my head in. And I realized I was being too formalistic, too rigid. So I blacked it out, and then I thought about the title of the painting. And the title was, "When you look into the abyss looks back at you." So by blacking out the seeds, the actual head of the sunflower with a figure in front of it, I made the center of the sunflower the abyss. and it somehow made the picture. It made the sunflower more menacing, which I hadn't thought about before. And really, if you see the painting, if you come to a show next week, you'll see it. And it's about, the whole thing pops up the idea of fear, the fear of looking ahead, about the human condition. So, chance has many positive things to the outcome.
I guess, yeah, looking at chance and all these different things that can play into a situation. And when you were talking about masks, that kind of brought up. Like, so with my poem, I start off looking at like kind of how mirrors can be mazes, and like there's actually so many intricate and sometimes hidden things beneath that we don't always see on the surface. And sometimes as the chance that kind of comes into all these decisions that we make, like kind of we think it might be a conscious decision on the surface, but actually there's all these things that play into it. I wanted to, I guess, just bring in how when we're kind of really made aware of those things and like kind of and the situation that we're in, it can then actually really alter the direction of it. So I really like the meta move you made of actually just like kind of making us very aware of the water that we're swimming in. Like kind of we have these theories, but like where do they actually come from? But also how do they then impact the space that we're in and the people that we're with, and like kind of that really embodied understanding of these aren't just abstract theories, that the art that we're creating, even if it's like coming from wherever it's coming from, it then has an impact on the people around us, and then those people around us have an impact on us, and it's this like constant like kind of feedback process. Yeah, and just there's kind of a chaos like kind of there.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think for me, one of the things is that I think logic is a real enemy of art in many ways, and I think if things are too sorted out and too clear, then the chance elements just don't work. I just went last week to see the Anselm Kiefer at Bermondsey, White Cube, and I thought in a way that it struck me that the thing about art and paintings in particular that are perplexing and perhaps interesting is that you don't get a clear sense of what they're really about. You think you know what they're about, and they're about all sorts of layers of things. But I think they are, when they are really at their best, and I think what Alina's talking about, this thing of form and content, you're looking at something like Velázquez, you can look at it over and over again, and it's still always elusive. It's never quite spelt out in some way. And I think that's where, for me, going back to the idea of chance, that can add to that level of something being slightly perplexing. So I think it's that complexity and layering that can draw the viewer back in. And I think it's something that is it's not quite as evident in the digitized image. I think it can be lost there, because I think it is to do with the manufacture. It's the physical handprint, it's that mud on the wall.
I came back in because we were going to have a panelist who's one of the exhibiting artists, who's Alan Lawson. And he has a very kind of, when I've heard him speak in other talks, he has this very embodied response to the subject that he's actually painting. His painting is the small painting on the wall there. And there's actually a photograph when you come in, which is the painting that exists underneath. And to go back to that idea of the corporeality, the physicality, and the interaction that we have with different media, which can happen, like you were saying, when you were negotiating the space in film, it's quite interesting that in paint, there is this element of the trace of that embodied experience. So painting is layered and layered and layered. And although it can happen in different ways with superposition of images, for example, in film, and language can have lots of different layers as well, there is that physicality of those decision-making processes that happens in drawing and painting, which I find quite exciting.
I'd like to carry on with that idea about chance, but I wouldn't call it chance. I'd call it something like above chance. I'll try and explain what I mean. That when I was at art school in the early 60s, believe it or not, we were persuaded to trace comics and print them in silkscreen prints and not to draw and not to paint. So therefore, nobody taught me anything about how to paint. And I spent many years devouring everything from the artist and illustrator to painting in the Renaissance workshop and everything, trying how to learn how to paint properly. And then I was reading a catalogue of a Manet exhibition that I'd been to, and there was a quote from Manet. I learnt two things from it. One was about swimming pools, and one was about approach to art. And he said that every time I start a painting, it's like diving into the deep end of a swimming pool and not knowing how to swim. So, and I know for me and for lots of other artists, to not know what you're doing is one of the most important things. If I know what I'm doing, when I first discovered this, what I started doing was saying, oh, I can do that, so I'll start working in pastels. Oh, I can do that, so I'll work. But it is so important for me, and I'm sure for lots of artists, that the chance is more a sort of elevated learning discovery chance, not just the sort of chance of Leonardo going up was it Leonardo who went to the place where all the dying people were because he wanted to draw monsters, and he found where the tubercular people were spitting and he drew that. Not that sort of chance, but a learning chance.
Hi, I'm going to abdicate in favor of the other camp because I think chance is a form of mystification. I would like to tell a little story. When Edgar Allan Poe published the poem The Raven, it was actually praised as a piece of emotional, it was more unconscious, and he actually refused that interpretation, and he went and wrote an essay where he deconstructed every single choice that he made and showed it was a very, very cerebral piece of work. And one of the translators of Poe into French was Baudelaire. And when you analyze the symbolists and you think it's all very unconsciously written, you realize that it's the opposite. It's absolutely perfectly constructed. So a lot of things that come across as chance are actually the result of planning, of a whole framework of work that guides you into a decision.
It's interesting how you're talking about the chance or the appearance of chance. She can't get away. I know that Sargent, for example, he's very well known for his brushstrokes. There may be a brushstroke that looks like it's just been, just cast across the painting like that, and it just beautifully describes something that's happening. But those who watched him work said, explained that he actually might redo that stroke again and again, and it was only the appearance of looseness. In fact, it was he had to work his way very carefully. And I think it's also like learning to drive or learning to dance. At the beginning, you're struggling with learning how to do. But then once you've learned how to do, like Max was saying, it's an elevated chance. It's not the chance of the universe, things just falling a certain way, that you've got an understanding and a knowledge about what you're doing. You know things about the materials you're using. So it's a different sort of chance, I'm just absolutely with Max there. It's an elevated sort of chance.
One of the things I do is take time-lapse videos of myself painting. And it started out as the idea, I suppose, I wanted to just document and demonstrate the process from beginning to end. But one of the things I found really curious was that my experience in front of the canvas, we talk about not knowing what you're doing. My experience from moment to moment in painting some of these pictures was exactly that, of really not knowing what I was doing. I felt like I was floundering. and pushing towards an obscure end to some extent. But the curious thing I found was that when I looked at the video and the whole thing was speeded up, the whole process seemed to unfold with an astonishing sense of purpose. But it wasn't a sense of purpose that I was totally conscious of at the time, or on the scale that, you know, that my mind was working. So I think there are some lessons there in the, I suppose, the strangeness, the deviousness of our own minds, the way we solve problems sometimes over a scale that we're not fully aware of. And that, I think, is, you know, I think chance can be fetishized. I think, you know, and the surface of a painting can be fetishized. I think there are some dichotomies, you know, like Alina brought up, like abstract and illustrative, that I think can also fetishize the surface, and they belong to a particular period in the development of thought about painting, which I'd associate with, you know, the early 20th century. And you know, Titian didn't think about whether he was abstract or illustrative, and I'm not sure that he thought about to put it a different way. I think he was thinking about what he could get away with, and it's more like where you're playing a game and you know that there are certain rules and some that you can shade, and I think that often happens, you know, like in music, you have similar ideas that developed at a certain point between pure music and program music, for example, which is a very, again, sort of late 1930s, 20th century idea. And there's been the tendency to push that back to, say, Bach, and say, oh, Bach, you know, this is a piece of pure music by Bach. Whereas I don't think he thought about that at all, you know. I think when Bach was writing a fugue, you know, a fugue, like, it's literally a chase, you know, that's what it is. It's voices chasing each other, and the rule is you better not sing in octaves, you know, that's the rule. You have to sing the same music, and you can't sing in octaves. So you have to do everything else, you know, you can invert it, you can go faster, you can go slower, but all the different voices, they can't line up, or if they do, you're breaking the rule. And that whole game then becomes, what can you get away with, you know? And that's where Bach's music takes off, because he tries every trick. You know, it's everything that an active mind can do to work within the parameters. So that, I think, is maybe a different way of looking at a painting, you know, to look at it, okay, what's the game here? What's the intention? And what can you get away with? And then concepts, you know, older concepts that would have been familiar from Titian, like from rhetoric, essentially, like ellipsis and things like that come in, which are a little bit more natural to a little bit more organic to the thought that actually generated the work. Because I think abstract and illustrative is, in some ways they're both dead ends to me, and particularly in terms of how far they've been pushed in the 20th century. I think we need to pull things back together into the middle, but also to get away from, you know, I think when we don't know what we're doing, we fetishize the surface, and it becomes all about, you know, art for art's sake and all of these. Whereas if you have you know, if you have a game plan, if you have a clear end, then it becomes a little bit more about being playful in terms of achieving those ends.
So no, sorry, it just triggered some ideas for me about perhaps using the analogy of an orchestra music and a piece of music. And I think about it in terms of a painting, and there will be different instruments in a piece of music that perhaps, or a particular style that will hold the piece together, but there'll be all the different other parts. So perhaps different types of artists and the different styles of painting. Some will be super realistic. Some will be thinking a lot about the material. Others are thinking about the content. Or there's all these different. A painting is woven from so many different things of what we do and feel as humans, and then the craft of what we're doing as well. And some will lean a bit more to one or the other, or even one particular artist will start in a certain way and they'll start to move in a different way. So I think we're looking at a very complex mix of things, and I think if as you say, if we fetishize, I can't even say it, one too much, we can lose some of the instruments we can have perhaps in our orchestral toolbox, as it were.
I think fetishization is always something that can happen, and it's always a danger or maybe just an aesthetic pleasure sometimes. It's really interesting because I'm so interested in different aspects of painting, and I decided to talk about that idea of form and content precisely because I do think that it all coalesces, especially in figuration, in this middle ground where you're playing around with the surface but also with the ideas that it's conveying. But at the same time, I think that, for example, one of the formal elements that we deal with a lot is the way we represent space. And one of the conventions that is constant throughout the history of painting, Western painting, I have to add, is that we are working with a Renaissance type space that developed with the idea of humanism, and actually going back to that Mantegna Christ who's lying down, where suddenly we're allowing ourselves to dethrone God, that actually perspective is being applied to a religious figure. And so suddenly the human being is the center of the world. And I think going back to this idea of the Anthropocene, we have to negotiate as painters, as people who make drawings, and work with a tradition of perspectival space that is laden with lots of values. It's laden with anthropocentrism, which is quite problematic in the Anthropocene. It's laden with this idea of a capitalist tradition, which is very problematic. And I think that we need to always be aware that we're questioning and constantly in dialogue with all of the traditions that we are working with, and not to be dictated by the traditions without being aware that there is a baggage and a cultural baggage there.
Yeah, just going off that, even so that there are even some critiques of should we even be using the Anthropocene to describe this period, because we've gotten into this current situation we're in with climate and all sorts of things, actually largely in part due to this very separatist way of thinking and experiencing ourselves in the world, and not realizing that we're actually part of this wider ecosystem. And again, it's this sort of, it's also very much through this dualist tradition of separation that we're seeing all different kinds of crises emerging. And that there's even just the potential danger of really putting ourselves into this Anthropocene mindset. We're we're the ones who now have to take charge of how all these earth systems move. And there's just some caution that needs to be taken around separating ourselves from the rest of the context, and again, just really embodying ourselves within the wider world system. So. I
wish I'd not mentioned chance now. It would have been a lot easier. Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting topics that are sort of permeating through the discussion, and I do think that this, one of the things that Alina's just picked up on is that use of space, is the idea that space in paintings is ambiguous. It's that thing that I think Ernst Gombrich said was about reciprocal neglect, so it's a flat surface, it's also an illusion. And for me, it comes back to what Connor was saying a bit earlier. I mean, why should anybody want to paint in the 21st century? And for me, I think it's because when you're doing it, you're doing it for the first time. I mean, the thing that gets me about painting is it doesn't get any easier. It's still a struggle, and in a way, I think that's part of maybe. I'm sure the same with filmmaking. It's an ongoing, perplexing challenge in a way that is maybe draws us into whatever it is we're interested in, and however we shape that experience.
You could describe the accident. You could call it an imperfection. You know, quite often, human beings write about or strive for utopian societies, but they always tend to break down because they're full of imperfections. We're full of imperfections, and in painting, I don't think that necessarily means to say they're bad things. It's not something that you shouldn't strive for. It'd be lovely if the world didn't have any conflict in it, but it might also take away some of the richness that we have in the world, because good things come out of conflict as well, in terms of the humanity that you show, that people show towards refugees and things like that. You see the dark side, but there is also it allows you to see the good side of humanity as well. So maybe there is a reason for conflict, and I think conflict exists within painting. So when you get those imperfections, I think you should sort of nourish them and enjoy them, and learn to recognise them, because you may not use them, and you may choose to obliterate them, but sometimes if you adopt them, they can be really interesting. I've looked at super realist paintings and marvelled at techniques, but actually ultimately sometimes I come away feeling okay. Could have taken a photograph.
I think something that I don't want to say losing and be so generalizing as that, but losing touch with the materials that we're using, like being able to marvel at the imperfections of a paint, is through a lot of paint that we're buying, if we're not creating it ourselves or find the pigment ourselves, is that we're actually losing a lot of, as painters, perhaps an embodied practice. But there are ways around that. You can make your own pigments. You can incorporate gesture. I was just wondering if you have any ways that you would say that you're embodied as a painter, but through your materials and I guess the surface.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that to answer that, I think it comes about through a sort of immersion in the thing, the stuff that is paint, and I think that I would hope that allows for a sort of embodied experience. Really, it's not always a technical thing. I think it is to do with state of mind, your relationship with this thing that is forever shifting, and the sort of flux of that surface and how it works. I mean, I find the whole thing deeply frustrating, really. And as I say, it just doesn't get any easier, and I kind of wonder why at times. But it's to do with that. I guess when you're not embodied, as it were, then maybe there is a sort of a disconnect, and that's not entirely helpful, I guess.
I'm just going to kind of go back one step, which is this idea of deciding whether you want to paint or not, or what medium you're going to use, and going back to the idea of the realities of the Anthropocene, and even linking to Connor's talk, the nosedive that's kind of happening, this dark potential age of lots of conflict, crisis, movement. And I can't help, it's something that I'm developing kind of maybe some drawings or series of paintings about this, that I can't help but imagine with mass migration of people that paintings will be used as tents. And actually there'll be loads of beautiful paintings that are just constructing these tents when people are actually breaking down urban environments and recreating new environments and negotiating spaces. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh, what a lovely idea. I want several tents. But I came in because of the idea of what we use to paint with. So, you know, Richard Long, he started doing big mud things on the wall, but how do you make it stick? I practiced with actually putting mud on my pictures, but it dries, so it's not the right colour. So I pay a lot of attention to the materials I use, and I use oil paints that are as pure as I can, partly because I'm very concerned about my environment, but so I make sure I don't drop oil paint when I'm standing near a mussel bed. You know, I don't want to pollute the environment. But also because when I'm painting outside, if it's below about 6 degrees, something like Winsor & Newton goes solid because it's got so many fillers in it. So I've got to use paint that's made a bit better, more expensive, more oil, more pigment. And that affects the painting, that affects the colours you can have, you know, it affects how it mixes, the feel of it. And so on a good day, the paint is just delicious. It's just lovely. And on a bad day, when I'm tired or whatever, it's claggy. So
I think that's great to listen to, and it feels very embodied, just like the knowledge of your paints and your materials, and you know how it feels quite directly on the canvas, whether it's harder or softer. And that's just like an exciting technical relationship you have with materials, which is almost like a dancer who knows their body and movement.
Wow. Thank you for such a fascinating exchange of ideas. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for, I know some people have had to leave a little bit earlier, so for those of you who've been here the whole day, for your participation and your attention and being here with us, with the work around here. I mean, the exhibition is finishing tomorrow, but I'm hoping, and Jen and I have always wanted this to be with a longer life. So a lot of this is going to go online. We've also got a catalogue that kind of lets things live a little bit longer. And the idea is to carry on the conversation, carry on the thinking, that this may be the beginning of conversations amongst yourselves. So you may have met people, and one of the things that's a shame, we didn't have Ellen Mora de Wachter, who was going to be part of the panel, who has written a Phaidon book about co-art and people working collaboratively in their art practice. I sometimes think that painters are kind of slightly despotic, alone in there, making their own decisions. And so it's really wonderful to bring painting to a collective and collaborative meaning-making session.
I think I've said just about everything I wanted to say. I'm just absolutely thrilled with the superb quality of input that's come from everyone. I'm so grateful that everyone's been so open and sharing, and just thank you everybody so very, very much, and a safe journey home. Fill in your forms, your feedback forms, and let's keep in touch. Like Alina says, we'll keep the Facebook going, but if we've got your emails, we'll start sending stuff out. We've got ideas about podcasts in the future. The film will be available, and thank you, everybody. Round of applause for all our artists and everyone. And one last thank you we've had a team of support. We've got Jessica down there, who's just worked her socks off with the teas and coffees and food. We've got a cameraman, Jonathan, over there, Max, my husband over there on the sound desk, Hugh, and everybody who's Joffrey over there hiding behind, and other people who've lent us things. Max has lent us stuff for the sound system, and everyone who's put effort, time, money. Charmaine was mentioned earlier, and all our artists again. Thank you very much, everybody.
And on behalf of us all, I want to thank Jen and Alina for doing a great job and starting this whole thing off. So thank you, and I'm sure it'll be the start of something more.
Everyone's popping now, so I'm going to pop. Thank you for the filmmakers and the poets and the writers and the models and everyone who isn't a painter, who's kind of joined us as well. And I wish I knew that there was this microphone when I gave my talk, because I love moving when I talk. So thank you to this whole kind of coalescing of people with different types of working processes and practices and coming together and exchanging ideas. Painting isn't just about being alone in your studio and making the work. It's also about coming together and actually talking about things and pushing things forwards in different directions.